Chimps can't go to war. Why? Chimps do not have legal systems. I want to be clear. I'm going to criticize this video. I've criticized her previous videos. I think she's legit. She's just wrong about a lot of stuff. Opening scene of Romeo and Juliet. Do you stick your thumb at me, sir? I do stick my thumb out, sir. And the Capulets and Montagues are shanking each other in the street en masse. Is that a war? No. Feuding families. Strictly speaking, a lot of you don't actually live in cities.
Male bonobos can hold some power in bonobo society, and female chimpanzees can hold some power.
This notion of power is similar as well. It's like, what do you mean they hold power? They have the legal right to make decisions? As encoded where? How? How is that understood?
This tolerance does not cross community lines, however. And in fact, chimpanzee communities are notoriously violent towards one another.
So are ants and bees. Territory is not simply a region of space. Territory is a region of space that has a legal existence. Even in Thomas Hobbes, the state of war in the state of nature is not the result of human beings being naturally warlike. It's the result of, in the absence of some higher institution to hold people into place by fear, there is a condition of such insecurity that people end up in a constant hostile posture towards one another as if in a war.
Or hunting their monkeys, or courting their females. Because of this, borders are patrolled.
Or courting their females. Did you catch that? See how very quickly we move from justifying war to justifying Jordan Peterson-esque sex essentialism, and indeed valorizing misogyny in evopsych terms. Because the females can be courted, right? We don't have an innate sense of being part of a racial group. Stop trying to argue that xenophobia is the way of nature, please. That is foolish. Do you know why Benedict Anderson, who is a problematic theorist in his own right, wrote a book called Imagined Communities? It's precisely because we needed a technological explanation for why it was that in modernity, we identify with vast groups of people that we didn't identify with before in the abstract, not based on one-to-one relationships, not based on people you've ever actually seen. I'm reading the article and I'm noticing she's doing very little original analysis. A lot of this is just summarizing the article's view. Well, that's disappointing. That's lazy. By treating nature as this fixed outer thing separate from us, we get to treat it as something to verify statements made by us. You said it was because of that doesn't make any sense. Why would that contribute necessarily to the increase in violence? Why would these be related? Are we just not going to ask that? Like, seriously? You're trying to do the psychological study of other organisms. This is exactly the kind of analysis that Woodefaltis does. He assembles a toolbox of black boxes and then just superimposes that over a map. What do we have here? We have mapped out the relations between chimps, and we're just imposing memeified understandings of human institutions to explain it based on the shape. I don't think she realizes that this is bullshit. I don't think she has the capacity to realize it's bullshit yet. Not because she's stupid, but because it's like, this stuff seems intuitive, and when a bunch of people in your field who are eminent in your field are engaging in the same thing, it's like, you just don't speak Ape Sunday? What are you talking about? I'm Canadian. Oh, we are covering Gutsick Gibbon. Why aren't we still talking about the Chimp Civil War? I've covered Gutsick Gibbon recently. I like Gutsick Gibbon. I think she's actually a legit channel. I'm going to have a lot of disagreements with her on this video. But for reasons that I can't be arrogant about, because they're reasons that I've been learning about over the last couple of years, and especially over the last 6 months. So, we're going to go through it, we're going to talk about it. Also in ways that I have not been learning about for the last 6 months. Let's be very clear right out the gate. Chimps can't go to war. Why? War is not simply organized conflict as observed by primatologists between groups. That is not how war works. War is fundamentally a legal distinction. A legal distinction entails that there is a self-understanding of the group as a legal entity, an entity with formal rules determining who is inside and who is outside. Now, there may be rules that determine who is inside and who is outside of a chimp family group, say, or a faction within family groups even, if we want to use that language. But there will not be a legal system that determines, for example, whether or not officially a group is in conflict with another officially recognized party. Wars are declared for this reason because it is a legal state of the suspension of normality, and a legal state in which the body of the community, the republic, the legal community, whatever you'd like, the political community, is in a official posture of hostility towards another group. Right? So for example, whether or not a chimp group, upon seeing one of their members be kind, say, to one that they're hostile towards, whether or not they would then, kill the one that was friendly to the one that they are hostile towards, doesn't mean that, therefore, that chimp is guilty of treason. Like, a chimp that shares a coconut or banana, whatever they eat, shares a mango. They have mangoes there? A chimp that shares a fruit with another chimp from another group that their group is attacking, okay? If that is observed, the other chimps might potentially gang up on it. I don't know if they would. I'm not a primatologist, but if they did, that would not therefore be, for example, punishment for treason. We may redescribe it as punishing a traitor, say, but we have to be very careful here, because just because something mirrors human behavior does not mean that cognitively the same thing is taking place. And it's not just negative. It's not just like, oh, do they not have the sophistication? It's like, it's also our legal structures also take the place of sometimes more direct, effective motivations for things. And one of the things that happens when we try to construe the behaviors of groups over here with groups over here in order to make them legible to each other based on appearance is that we tend to superimpose our prejudices over the actual behavior of that group. And this happens when we observe animals. It also happens when we observe human groups. And this becomes very difficult because people have this developmental notion that is actually white nationalist and imperialist in nature. But because they have internalized the idea that Western culture, quote unquote, is more evolved and more developed, that therefore not attributing the specific institutions of quote-unquote Western societies to non-Western societies is somehow an insult. A case that comes up very frequently is when people are trying to decide whether or not, for example, non-Western communities have things like philosophy or religion. Like the notion of animism came about precisely because Edward Burnett Tyler, he was trying to do something that he thought was more inclusive and more progressive relative to, not in those terms specifically, but relative to other anthropologists that regarded tribal groups in like the Amazon or what have you as being too primitive to have religion. So this notion of animism was invented in order to locate spiritual discourse and activity in rocks and trees and so on and so forth, right? But the mistake there is pretty obvious. Rather than allow for people to organize themselves differently, he had to insist on them having the germ of Western civilization within them in order to apologize for their existence. It was actually as racist as the people who said they didn't have the capacity to, because he simply displaced that argument, right? But similarly, when you're looking at animal behaviors, like, do ants have politics or do ants have war? No, they don't have legal understanding of themselves. Do they collectively as a group become hostile and violent towards other groups of ants or other animals or what have you? Absolutely they do. And it can even look like a war from above. You've got all these little like units swarming these other units. Looks like a war. But it's not even about superimposing human psychology onto non-human animals. You're superimposing institutional situations onto non-human animals. Case in point, not all human organizations are capable of war, right? Sports teams are not capable of war. They don't have a legal understanding of themselves. Sports fans aren't capable of war. You can have mobs. It'll look like a war. You can have mobs of sports fans from opposing teams clashing in the streets. People have talked about this as like an instance of civil war, or like a question about like the relative violence or peacefulness of modern humans, quote unquote. But that's not a war. It's mass violence. Sure, it may even sometimes be organized. That does not make it a war. War has to be illegal. It is specifically a legal distinction. And chimps do not have legal systems. They are not thinking to themselves, that chimp over there who shared his banana with that chimp from that opposing group, that chimp has violated his duty as post in a state of war. That chimp is guilty of treason. That chimp must be destroyed for the sake of chimp civilization. No, they don't think that way. They don't have a concept of any of that stuff. They get angry because chimp nice to chimp they're not nice to, and they kill chimp. Now, one of the things that came out in the previous video by Gutsick Gibbon that we covered, by the way, does that sound too loud for you? Because I can close that door. There's a tribe of gorillas, though, that is actively having a war of succession, though. No, they're not having a war of succession. They're not doing that. Some hype man for, and in some I fucking love science community was like, guys, look, gorillas are having a war of succession. Nature is awesome. They're not having a war. That's not how that works. That is not how that works. Imagine, if you will, taking this logic to evolution at the microbial level. Look, guys, they're organizing intelligent design. No, you wouldn't do that. It's the exact same mentality, and it's very frustrating to see people fall into it, because you should know better. bluntly, at this point. It's a sign of education failing at the upper echelons of academia, bluntly, because a good dose of actually being educated in legal and political history would kind of lay bare like how very specific a lot of these things are. But people want to find profundity in nature, which is fine, but they want it on the cheap, and they find it by projecting their prejudices into nature. So the profound move for them is not, oh my god, I've understood the process by which this complex dynamic comes to existence. That's profound. Rather, it's, look guys, I found out how animals are actually doing all the same things we do, but they don't. And moreover, they're not lesser because they don't. And the assumption that they're lesser if you say they don't is itself prejudice, right? That is itself chauvinistic, and it's deeply frustrating. So in the previous video, she was talking about how, like, she was engaging in what some people have called the myth of scarcity. Pierre Clastres, I believe, calls it this in Society Against the State. And the idea is there were subsistence, not the myth of scarcity, the myth of subsistence. Primitive peoples, quote unquote, had a great disadvantage over moderns. Okay, that's why they didn't form states. They only had enough food to just survive, and so their entire existence was built around just surviving, just having enough to scrape by. And so they didn't develop philosophy or art or science or what have you. They didn't have all of the technological advantages of Europeans because they just didn't have the leisure time. They were too busy surviving. I just came back from a museum that is just filled with these massive, monumental totem poles that took tremendous skill and tremendous coordination and organization to assemble. There were tools that ranged from the very simple shells sharpened at one end to be scraping knives, to the very ornate, masterful carvings out of whalebone that actually made use of the, I don't know what you call it, but the pulp-like structure, the comb-like, the sponge-like structure inside of the whalebone. Thank you, JC. Appreciate it.
JC Schmidt super chatted $4.99.
You get a random fact in a moment. They had used the pulp of the sponge-like pulp of the inside of the shell to make it so that as they carved a canoe or a boat full of Inuit, the texture of the bone matched the texture of their fur pelts. This is a level of skill that requires tremendous marrow. Thank you. Good God. It requires tremendous practice. Like long hours of doing this over and over again. You know who doesn't do this? Someone who is only able to survive. Gutsick Gibbon was sort of playing into this, where it's like, oh, well, you know, before they didn't have science because, you know, they spent all of their time just trying to get by. Now, in terms of the class divisions of societies, it is true. There are people in different cultures, including ours, who are worked to the bone and don't find themselves actually able to engage in pursuits that would be self-improvement. This is a far cry from saying that the society as a collective lacks the ability to create a surplus that it can then use to justify engaging in leisurely activities, leaving aside the fact that you can't actually do work all day long prior to electric lighting. And so people talked. They looked at things, they thought about things. One of the things that Claude Lévi-Strauss talks about in La Pensée Sauvage is how the encyclopedic knowledge of plants and animals by native guides for Western anthropologists was profoundly unproductive. It was not utilitarian. They knew the names of things and had named things that were useless, and they remembered them because they took an interest in their environment for its own sake. They were not doing what they did solely based upon a need to survive in the moment constantly. Like these little things, these weird little chauvinistic tropes, well-meaning people, and I think Gutsick Gibbon is a well-meaning person. I want to be clear, I'm going to criticize this video. I've criticized her previous videos. I think she's legit. She's just wrong about a lot of stuff, which is okay. Ostensibly, a lot of these I fucking love science people are really big on, you know what's really cool is learning that you're wrong about something. I think Lawrence Krauss said that once, probably in between defending Jeffrey Epstein, but I digress. The world is very complicated. It is very hard to know everything, and one of the reasons why primatology in particular is so dangerous as a field, which is not to say I don't like primatology, one of the reasons why it's so dangerous as a field, why the stakes are so high, is because oftentimes people who focus on evolution from a strictly biological point of view end up mistakenly trying to attribute human development and human artifice to those same evolutionary principles, and they fall into extremely condescending and not to say racist tropes. They didn't intend to. I don't think she intends to, but they did. Being educated on this stuff is hard. You have to learn a lot of things that are deeply unintuitive, and you gotta exercise a lot of patience sometimes. What ultimately matters is that people are struggling and trying. The people who deserve no understanding are the people who don't even try. Your argument seems to rely heavily on your definition of war. On the simplest level, war is just two groups fighting each other. No, it's not, because we have two groups fighting each other, but they're not at war. This is basically how you understand categories, right? You can have groups that fight each other without war. So war at its simplest level is not two groups fighting each other. War is always legally illegal groups between each other, right? They need to be bound by some principle extrinsic to the bare fact of being around each other. Tribes have religious rights that determine who is responsible for making decisions, who has the right to make decisions, and so on. Even like North American communities that live in virtual isolation from other large communities, like for example, like smaller groups of nomads, they still have principles that determine who makes the decisions or how decisions are determined, and it is that collectivity, it is at that level that war takes place. Yeah, exactly. War is not when 4 people have a 2v2. Exactly, yes. Anyways, I digress. We are going to get into Why Aren't We Still Talking About the Chimp Civil War by Gutsick Gibbon, and we're going to have a lot of fun. But before we do, JC Schmidt has super chatted without text, which means JC gets a fact. And your fact is, the best estimates suggest that around 205,000 tons of gold have been mined throughout history. This means that if you were to take all of the gold ever mined and press it into a cube, the resulting cube would only be about 22 meters wide on each side, which means it would still fit in Hassan Piker's house.
I feel very strongly that we are not talking enough about the Chimpanzee Civil War that just happened in Uganda. Like, the internet loves to meme about the concept of chimp war, and there are a lot of really good videos about the previous Chimpanzee War that we had, but then we get an actual new chimpanzee war, and it's a civil war, and people talk about it for like a week, and then they move on.
Like, think about this for a second. What's the difference between a civil war and a feud between families? Here's a question. Is the premise of Romeo and Juliet, does Romeo and Juliet begin with a civil war? Opening scene of Romeo and Juliet. Do you stick your thumb at me, sir? I do stick my thumb out, sir. And the Capulets and Montagues are shanking each other in the street en masse. Is that a war? No. Feuding families. A civil war is specifically when the civitas is at war against itself. It's actually a condition of the political community dying and forming into two competing ones that are trying to take over the territory of the previously existing regime. You do not have a civil war without the civil as a rule. You need politics to have a civil war. Politics is not simply the fact of domination. That would allow us to, for example, talk about rock politics in the sense of which rock ends up on top. And if that seems absurd, because no, we're not talking about rocks, we're talking about organisms, obviously. What about the first pre-organisms? Their competition for dominance. The first replicators, right?
On to other news, like the end of the world or whatever. There are a lot of fake chimpanzee intergroup conflict fans.
Doesn't civil come from city? Civil comes from civitas. And you have to be careful. Once again, a lot of this is deeply intuitive. Civitas does not mean city as we understand it. When you think of a city, what do you think of? If you're in North America, you probably think of big buildings, shopping malls, urban centers. There's a hint there. Highways, government buildings, etc. Restaurants, suburbs, there's another hint. The actual physical structure refers to the urbs. The civitas is the community. Strictly speaking, a lot of you don't actually live in cities.
On the internet is what I'm saying. Not like me, a real chimpanzee intergroup conflict fan covering the subject months after the fact. I've been really busy. Hello, my gentle and of course very modern apes. My name is Erica. This is my channel, Gutsick Gibbon, and what we do here is I talk to you about the latest discoveries in human evolution and adjacent topics, and I also debunk a lot of pseudoscience. Today, I would like to take a closer look at a new chimp war that just happened over the past decade or so, and that's what it is.
I really hope we're actually going to that's what it is. Okay. I was going to say, I really hope we actually interrogate what is meant by war here, but if we're just taking that naively, that's deeply frustrating. Like, aren't you curious? Don't you want to think about that? Like, what is actually entailed? I find that very frustrating. I find it frustrating. And I like Gutsick Gibbon's channel. I've appreciated her content before. This betrays a level of naivete and carelessness that I really dislike. It's something that's actually really dangerous in scientists, especially in science educators, because it cements an understanding of war into a false notion of human nature that is itself derived from a notion of nature that is incorrect. Nature as a fixed thing, a fixed and homogeneous thing. War cannot be transcended. Certain types of human organization are impossible because we must constantly deal with the constant threat of war. War being something that is simply omnipresent. Look, even our primate ancestors, as evidenced by the primates that we cohabit the world with, they still go to war. So obviously, that is not a thing that we can overcome because it's in our blood. Not how that works. One of the most important parts, nobody talks about this and it's frustrating, the most important parts of the critique of Hobbes, the Hobbes-Rousseau debate, and people conflate Rousseau as being like a noble savage person. He's not really. The Hobbes-Rousseau debate is that for Hobbes, as a result of the circumstances of the natural condition of the state of nature, human beings, regardless of temperament, will be driven into a posture of war against each other, of ongoing open hostility. Now, he uses this term incorrectly as well, but ongoing open hostility, a state of war that way. Michel Serres criticizes this. Rousseau, however, will make the very important point that the conditions that Hobbes treats as a part of the state of nature actually depend upon human institutions, property, reputation, honor, jealousy, monogamy, for example. Things that are instituted in societies but are not necessarily a part of our genetic makeup. These are things that we, for better or for worse, decided at one point or other to do in certain places and not always in others. Franz de Waal's Critique of Hobbes 2, I haven't read that. I should look at it. Here's the point, though. War is institutional, and the warlike posture of humans is the result of us being conditioned and created in a world where those institutions reign. So we are raised from childhood to have reputation, a sense of a reputation, what Rousseau calls amour propre, love of self, but not just love of self in a general sense where you're on your own team. Love of self in the sense that there's a part of you, like a double of you. I was going to say a double you, but that's confusing for alphabetical reasons. There's a double of you that exists socially apart from the physical you, right? There's you, the organism that exists at this part of the globe. And then there's the you that as you are seen and positioned in society, and you want that to thrive. That's amour propre. And on the basis of wanting that to thrive, wanting that to be dominant, you will be motivated to do violence to other people, to get revenge when they insult you, for example, to assert yourself as powerful when they might think you're weak. Whereas someone in a state of nature, Rousseau would argue, if someone kicked them out of their tree who's stronger than them, they might not spend their time seething about how to get revenge. They might just move away to another tree. To say that chimps have civil war is actually to import human institutions into our understanding of chimpanzee psychology, which is dangerous because one of the major interests in primatology is that it gives us insight into how human ancestors outside of civilization operate, which means what do we take with us from a homogeneous fixed nature into society? What does society have to address? What does society exist to fix? What do institutions have to do, right? Which massively narrows the scope of the range of possible institutional forms that you will consider to be viable. So this is deeply political. It's importing political concepts, and it's exporting an understanding of politics rooted in a false conception of nature. This is one of the reasons why people like Latour and Donna Haraway and Michel Serres are so important, because they challenge that notion, right? They challenge the notion of there being a fixed nature to begin with.
That's not clickbait. It's chimp war. Let's talk about the chimp war.
That's cute.
Oh boy, an opportunity to monologue about chimpanzee behavior. I'm even wearing my thematically appropriate custom Will Wood t-shirt.
Look at that shirt. It's telling you the story right there.
Big talk for...
See? Like, to be clear, we don't come from chimpanzees. Chimpanzees cohabit the earth with us. We have different primate ancestors. But the use of chimps is specifically to give us a window into our natural beginnings outside of civilization, which they don't. Because we aren't... There is no distinction between the natural and the unnatural, and the civilized and the natural, etc. There is simply the history of what animals on this planet have done in their environments. and how they have changed as a result, and how they've changed their environments as a result, and so on and so forth, in one big holistic system. And we do not understand the behaviors of this by reference to the behaviors of this, because these are different things. These are different things. I don't know what's going on here, but these are different things.
For chimpanzee, and the talk is a declaration of war. Chimpanzees, or members of Pan troglodytes, are some of our closest living relatives, sharing that position with their sister species, Pan paniscus.
Oh god, she's gonna do it.
Or the bonobos. Our lineage, the hominins, split from their lineage, the Pannons, approximately 7 million years ago, and they've been changing and evolving for just as long as we have. Bonobos and chimpanzees are sister species, so they share a lot in common. So much in common that you would be forgiven for thinking that they're more or less the same thing, but they're not. They differ in really important ways. Subtly, the physical ways in which they differ, chimpanzees tend to be more robust and larger than bonobos are. They have longer canine teeth, whereas bonobos are smaller and more gracile. Bonobos have longer head hair than chimpanzees do, pinker lips. But the most striking ways in which these two species differ is their behavior. The historical and overly simplistic summary is that chimpanzees are violent and patriarchal, they have an alpha male, and bonobos are peaceful and matriarchal. They have an alpha female. I say it's overly simplistic because species are composed of populations which have their own unique characteristics, and populations are composed of individuals which have their own unique personalities. And we found, looking at bonobos and looking at different chimpanzee subspecies, that bonobos can sometimes be pretty aggressive, and chimpanzees can be pretty peaceful. Male bonobos can hold some power in bonobo society, and female chimpanzees can hold some power.
This notion of power is similar as well. It's like, what do you mean they hold power? What do you mean? They have the legal right to make decisions? As encoded where? How? How is that understood? Like, what do you mean power? Do they get to this? Do they control the property? Do they have a legal right to the property? What are you talking about? Do they determine where the borders are? Do they have a conception of borders? You gotta be careful here, because some people will say they do. Look, they patrol borders. You will see this said. Here's the problem, though. The conception of territory is also legal in nature. Behavior that involves patrolling a certain geographical region, right? A certain portion of the earth. See, I almost fell into it. You see, we use these terms colloquially so much, we tend to take them for granted. Creatures, organisms that patrol like regions of space. Is that territory? That's what white blood cells do. That's what fish do. Do they have a notion of territory being trespassed upon? And you have to be really careful. The superficial appearance of resembling the behavior of, large numbers of soldiers in formation or what have you, amongst a termite population, say, does not mean that the activity that is taking place is to be understood in the same terms as human institutions. Humans, however, do not travel in groups of 200 or more. Yeah, they do. What? They do all the time. What are you talking about? B-movie is a documentary.
Power in chimpanzee society. Previously, bonobos were characterized as sort of sexually interesting, and we've since found that chimpanzees can get pretty freaky, and likewise chimpanzees have been previously characterized as like the cooperative tool users, the hunters, and we've since found out that bonobos use tools and also hunt as well. Still, for all of the nuanced behavioral overlap that we've since discovered with chimpanzees and bonobos, there is still one thing that chimpanzees kind of hold a monopoly on, and it happens to be one of the things that they share with us: war, and a capacity to systematically wipe out a neighboring group that you don't like.
Viruses have the ability to wipe out a neighboring group. Fungi have the ability to wipe out a neighboring group. Water has the ability to wipe out land, dry land. Does water go to war? No. That we don't like? What do you mean you don't like? What do you mean you don't like? Is there a racial prejudice between the different chimp groups? What do you mean they don't like them? Because the hatred, for example, that motivates war between humans is not a simple dislike, it's something abstract. They have a conception of the other as an entity to be destroyed. Chimps, I'm pretty sure, just kill off the enemy until they don't see them anymore. They don't necessarily have a conception of, we need to paint the map this color. Okay, there's no chimp equivalent to the Wololo priest in Age of Empires. I've never seen a train, quote unquote. You said these large man-eating snakes live underneath the cities. Yeah, exactly.
Like,
Okay, here's the thing. I do
Hence DeWall's point about the language we use to talk about non-human animal behavior and organization needing to be understood only heuristically. Exactly. It's only a heuristic. So I would have no problem with this video if she started off with like, hey guys, let's talk about the chimp war. And to be clear, it's not actually a war. We don't understand fully the psychology here, but it seems like this population of chimpanzees is engaging in a seemingly organized and systematic extermination of a fellow one within this region. And they seem to patrol this line of space in this region, and they don't seem to be interested beyond this region or so on. That's how you would describe it. Being careful. When you're imposing war as your description, you're not doing science anymore because you've already explained it in advance of knowing anything about chimp psychology. Those chimps don't even have uniforms either. I mean, they might have. I wouldn't necessarily be sure of that. Sometimes animals mark off spaces too, or even their coats.
truly have a pure and kind and loving good heart. But also, if I start to feel overwhelmed, I do turn quite evil and sinister. And I think God gave me that curse to balance out my pure heart.
I'm using these words deliberately. I'm choosing to use them because I think they're appropriate. I don't think what we're looking at here is a case of anthropomorphization. Let's back up.
But it is. Okay, so this is what she's going to do, and I haven't seen this before, but I'm going to tell you with accuracy what she's going to do, and we can see if I'm right or not. She is going to say, well, hang on, this isn't anthropomorphization because look, the chimps have leaders and they have followers and they patrol territory and they appear to have goals and they appear to engage in these attacks non-incidentally, as in they plan and decide, which is a little bit fascinating given the fact that she doesn't regard, certain human groups as being capable of generating enough of a surplus to plan and decide and do science and have thoughts and creativity and whatnot, but leaving that aside. So it's not an anthropomorphization because they are literally going to war. Here's the problem though. You are literally looking at a formation of animals, non-human animals, and going, look, this has the rough pyramidal shape of how I would draw a human hierarchy on a piece of paper. They must be doing human institutional things. No, you cannot leave your critical faculties and your intellectual humility at the door of, I have seen something that superficially resembles in silhouette something that I've seen somewhere else. That's not how you do science. This is why a principle of humility is so important, because you cannot be leaping to explanations that you then impose as a black box, because you move immediately from the chimps are engaging in war to the dynamics of chimp warfare. And then comparing chimp warfare to human warfare. And at no point then are you actually studying the chimps anymore. Now you're studying the formations of the chimps. And you're using that as a black box that's fulfilling the function of an understanding of chimp psychology. And chimp psychology is no longer in question. And what's more dangerous is that human psychology is no more in question, because you're comparing the two to see what the natural basis is of human institutions, leaving aside the particularity of the history of human activities. The reasons, for example, why humans engage in those formations, because you might think on the basis of the closer proximity to nature of our primate cousins, that therefore these formations are the result of our genetic engagement with the environment. Evolutionary psychologists do this all the time. They will look at, for example, misogynistic practices, sexism, etc., certain types of social division, the institution of slavery, and so on. It's different types of, emotional issues, and they will look at primates, and they will say at other primates, and they will say, like, look. These chimps do this over here. So obviously what's happened is we've evolved to do this, and this is why we are like this over here. And it's never like, well, maybe someone figured out how to do a thing that simply resembles this because it works. And it's not actually anything to do with what the chimps did. There's no relation between them. Maybe it works over here. Maybe it works for them over here. Maybe it doesn't work for everybody. And maybe it doesn't even work as well as some other organization would work for the chimps. But they superficially look the same, so therefore. And it's actually very silly, right?
At Arthur Miemenhauer 3615 super chatted $108.34. Is this enough to get you to do a theory segment on any John Mearsheimer video you choose?
Does the Pope have giant rabbit ears hidden under his hat? Of course it is. Can we go through this first, or do you want me to do it right now? What do you want me to do? Do you have a preference? Why don't you think of a preference of a John Mearsheimer video, or I'll look for one afterwards, but that's absolutely enough.
Chimpanzees live in complicated social systems
We're not going to go through the whole thing. I wanna get through the anthropomorphization, then we'll go.
Let's back up. Chimpanzees live in complicated social systems characterized by a fission-fusion dynamic. What this means is that they live in relatively large groups composed perhaps of dozens of individuals. But
Evo psychologists do this with human interaction too. They do this with everything. It's wild.
That larger group subsets down into smaller groups depending on the time of year. Simplistically speaking, when food is abundant, that larger group is maintained. Relationships and connections are reaffirmed. But when food is scarce, that larger group fissions out into smaller groups who forage on their own until a time at which food is abundant again, in which case those smaller groups will fuse back into the larger
You can go through this? Thank you. Bless you, friend. You were keeping the lights on.
Group again. And so it goes. That larger group size is the given chimpanzee's community. Everybody within that larger group knows one another, and if when they are fissioned out into their smaller groups, they encounter one another, they will do so typically amicably. Fissioned chimpanzee groups within a larger chimp community know each other, and so oftentimes they like each other, or at the very least they tend to tolerate one another, unless there's a reshuffle for power going on. This tolerance does not cross community lines, however, and in fact, chimpanzee communities are notoriously violent towards one another.
So are ants and bees and wasps. I don't know about that with bees, but there are lots of organisms that have hostility towards other groups of similar organisms. There are lots of organisms that have hostility towards other groups of the same organism. This is not enough to say that, oh, they go to war. And you can kind of see the move that's taking place here. And this is taking a whole lot of politics for granted, because she's assuming that politics is simply any activity involving an aggregate of human beings, right? So you can have war, obviously, because we have communities that fight each other. Isn't that enough? Well, no. No, it's not. And what are the stakes here? What is at stake in football fans of opposing teams fighting each other in groups in the street, not being called war? What is at stake in that? Well, because war as an institution carried out between states has a different logic behind it than merely an effective response to something you like being hurt or desiring something that is scarce. War is, in particular, something that is declared as a legal institution because it is meant for the mobilization of a political community. It is the basis, the legality is the basis of the mobilization of the political community, not the desire of the population, the legal logic undergirding it. So what happens when you call what chimps do when they engage in group conflict, what happens when you call that war, is that you erase the arbitrary nature of state violence, and you transform it into a natural part of the human condition. Which means, congratulations, you have just made us intellectually incapable of thinking our way out of considering war as a necessary part of human life. Now there has to be war. And the political question is no longer, how do we live without war, or how do we get rid of war, or how do we end state violence? The question now becomes, given the necessity of violence, how do we win in such a way that we can then control the violence? With the presumption underneath, in the exact same way as when people criticize capitalism for breaking the social contract, they presume that capitalism is capable of living in a relationship of honor and reciprocity with human beings. You make it so that the institution of war is presumed in any political arrangement you can contrive. You end up being the originator of a defensive war, because chimps don't go to war. Chimps break down into groups that fight each other. That's what we know. That's what we know. And what's very frustrating is you will see these people, and you saw this in this little diagram that she showed. You will see people be really impressed by the fact that we can draw on a piece of paper, we can map out the formations that we observe non-human animals engaging in. And look, it looks like a constitution, doesn't it? Carl Schmitt could have written a nomos of the chimp, right? Perfectly plausible. The problem, of course, is that we can understand the legal structures, the nomoi, of human groups because they write about them. We can talk to them. They can tell us what they did. They can tell us we carved out this lot of land, we assigned it to this person. This person farmed on this person's land. This person didn't want them to farm on that land. Therefore, we adjudicated between them. This group of people jumped in to defend that violation of that property. This group of people jumped in to condemn that violation of property, and the civitas split into two opposing groups that wanted to reassert a different legal order because the previous one was obviously not satisfying to them. That's a civil war. That's not what's happening with chimps. Chimps aren't doing that. Chimps are engaging in behavior based upon group dynamics and affect. There isn't a logic there that we, for example, could turn into a legal dispute. Wars are also legal disputes in a certain key way. They are a legal state of affairs, and they are ended with a treaty, right? Or with a surrender, formally. They are ended with terms. Chimps don't propose terms to each other. There are no conditions of the end of the war, which means there's no war.
In relatively large groups composed perhaps of dozens of individuals, but the group is maintained. Relationships and connections are...
When you go back to where we were.
In case those smaller groups will fuse back into the larger group again. And so it goes. That larger group size is the given chimpanzee's community. Everybody within that larger group knows one another, and if when they are fissioned out into their smaller groups, they encounter one another, they will do so typically amicably. Fissioned chimpanzee groups within a larger chimp community know each other, and so oftentimes they like each other, or at the very least they tend to tolerate one another, unless there's a reshuffle for power going on. This tolerance does not cross community lines, however, and in fact, chimpanzee communities are notoriously violent towards one another. Communities occupy a territory, and because these communities are often...
Okay. Territory, like politics, has to be used as a heuristic. I like that language by Dewall. We talk about spaces as if they are territories, as if they simply mean the same thing. The territory of so-and-so, right? The map is not the territory. Territory is not simply a region of space. Territory is a region of space that has a legal existence. There is an understanding of that space as having essentially a legal essence. There is an understanding that this space is owned, that this space is for, that this space is not for something, that this space is appropriate for someone to trespass through or not appropriate for someone to trespass through. We talk about territory in abstract in the same way. We talk about the territory, for example, of different fields. Simply traversing and fighting anything within a given space, even if another organism, us, can look at this and draw lines around the space where that activity is taking place and show definitively where that activity is not taking place, does not mean that you have territory. Franz de Waal's Chimpanzee Politics and Primates and Philosophers should be on your reading list for sure. I will take that under advisement. I'll download them tonight. I may actually do a video response to this after the Collier one because they relate. There's a great book by Stuart Eldon called The Birth of Territory. And I'm not going to get into the details because this should be enough for you. There is a birth of territory in human institutions. We do not have territory out the gate. Territory is something that we had to develop as an idea. Territory did not always make sense to us. Land ownership did not always make sense to us. Territory presumes a specific relationship between legal apparati and land, between our legal understanding of ourselves and land. Chimpanzees do not have a legal understanding of land. And the reason why I'm specifying legal is because for chimpanzees, their behavior does not correspond to the logic of a simulated abstraction wherein groups are understood as having an essence. Right? We don't, for example, hear about chimpanzees having an ideological dispute. We don't hear about them having a religious dispute. Why? Well, because religion and ideology, those are legal understandings. In a loose sense, right? These are understandings of the group as being formed by principles that are understood intellectually. Chimps don't identify each other that way. We know this because humans don't naturally identify each other that way. And by naturally, I mean deep into our prehistory, because we know it's actually in modernity that a lot of these groups are formed. And on it goes. Like, we're going to see just, she legitimately does not realize she's anthropomorphizing these chimps to the extreme. It doesn't occur, because she thinks war is just a thing that happens. It's not a human invention. It's just when you have a lot of animals over here fighting a lot of the same animals over here, that's war. There's a reason why war is politics or policy by other means in Clausewitz. There's a reason why, because it actually is a political institution, very much so. Even when we talk about mob wars, there are formal and informal understandings of the group that are based on proximity to basically a code. Not in the Pirates of the Caribbean sense, although that would be an example, but in the sense of there are understood abstract relations and codes of conduct that govern, and relations of power and authority that govern the idea of what is taking place between groups, which is why mobs are capable of having truces and de facto treaties. War never changes. I mean, you can actually find, like, once you have an understanding of war as a legal institution, as a legal situation, certain logics can obtain with some regularity when that state of affairs is invoked, is begun, right? So you can have a situation where war can be understood as a thing. However, it is not a thing that is simply there unconditionally as the basic starting point of life. Even in Thomas Hobbes, the state of war in the state of nature is not the result of human beings being naturally warlike. It's the result of, in the absence of some higher institution to hold people into place by fear, there is a condition of such insecurity that people end up in a constant hostile posture towards one another, as if in a war. Now, he conflates these. Thomas Hobbes has a poor and overly homogeneous understanding of these principles. Even his notion of the state of nature is deeply problematic, so for reasons we've talked about before. Nature as a homogeneous other thing ends up being a person to the discourse of how we discuss and think about the place of humanity in the world, the place of politics in the world, the relationship between politics, society, our environment, and so on, when in fact there is no one nature and we are not separate from it. And in fact, this notion of nature results in people like this studying chimpanzees and then believing that they have found the root or a connection between that which is out there and indisputable and fixed, and that which human beings do by choice. And so now we don't just understand the chimps more, we understand war more. And because chimps are related to humans, we understand human war. We understand humans more. And that's kind of a problem. Or animals in general more. Or affect, or emotion, or social organizations, or the conditions of cooperation, right?
Adjacent to one another, communities feel the need to patrol and guard those territories to prevent chimps from other communities from coming into theirs and, like, eating their fruit or hunting their monkeys or courting their females. Because of this, borders are patrolled.
Or courting their females. Did you catch that? Thoughts on posthumanism? Love it. Did you catch that? They patrol their borders, the borders of their territory, to prevent opposing chimp groups from courting their females. See how very quickly we move from justifying war to justifying Jordan Peterson-esque sex essentialism, and indeed valorizing misogyny in evopsych terms, because the females can be courted, right? Females aren't on the same page about this. So, chimp war is a masculine activity. Ooh. Masculine's another word you should watch out for. But that's the move. She's equating alpha males to human warlords. She's allowing for that equivocation, because she's, once again, like, she doesn't realize that territory is an anthropomorphization. Because she thinks an anthropomorphization, as a lot of people do when they're naive to this stuff, they think anthropomorphizing is when you say, oh, well, these organisms are motivated by human emotions, like jealousy and ambition, and usually negative emotions, right? The problem is that the names we give to things are based upon what we identify in the world as affordances already. We name things that we can engage with, and our legal systems and our legal history proliferates, invents kinds of things that we can engage with. Sort of like how morality it like creates new things that you can engage with, right? So this is what Nietzsche talks about in the genealogy of morality. Human beings have drives to dominate. We're actually made up of many little things that have a drive to win out and satisfy their innate desire to expel their energy. But sometimes we encounter something stronger than us and it subjugates us, and we're not very happy about that. But we're not strong enough to then vent our need to retaliate, so we need to invent another avenue for that retaliation, another avenue for venting it. So we invent planes of existence wherein we are able to exact our revenge. And these can take the form of, for example, a notion of justice, right? You won the fight, but you were unjust. We were just even though we lost, and so we still won. Like it's highly inventive. And on that basis, we can then start creating institutions around morality. Now all of a sudden we're talking about morals, and we're geographically arranging the world based upon our understanding of morals. People do this with race. They do this with notions of development. They do this with notions of all sorts of things. They do this with the distinction between places of war and places of non-war and whatnot. Even when you're talking about war, that bifurcation of the world into states of war and states of non-war allows for the creation of affordances that are unique to those two spheres. Therefore, there are more affordances than there were before. And the general idea of an affordance is like, it's a thing you can grasp. It's a thing your organism is able to engage within the world as an object. Even though, strictly speaking, there isn't a sharp distinction between an object and its environ, right? Actual matter is continuous with all the rest of matter. So she doesn't realize that that's an anthropomorphization. She thinks that that's just there. War is just like it's like the square hole in a children's toy. That's all. You just identify. You know it when you see it, so to speak.
Controlled by groups of chimpanzees, usually composed of males, although not always, which is interesting in and of itself. And if this patrol encounters a foreigner, they will attack them, sometimes killing them. This was originally quite shocking when observed by Jane Goodall and associates decades ago because of how familiar it was. So many animals live in groups, from deer to baboons, and of those group living animals, many of them are also territorial. Lions come to mind. A male lion usually guards his pride, composed of females who he is monopolizing access to, and while the females are off doing a lot of the hunting, this male will spend time patrolling the territory, making sure other bachelor males don't come in and try to mate with the females or kill his offspring. But this is one male carrying out territorial patrolling behavior, and if he encounters another male, they're gonna duke it out, but it doesn't feel quite as personal. And I also use that word deliberately. When chimpanzee patrols happen across a foreigner, they do try to kill that individual oftentimes, especially if that foreigner happens to be a male, but there's a sort of cruelty to it that I don't think we see very often, if at all, in other animals.
Well, you clearly haven't seen a hyena literally rip the anus out of a zebra before.
Except for one. You can read these accounts in scientific papers, or you can watch some pretty horrific videos found on YouTube or on Instagram or on TikTok. But the way that this usually works is there is a lot of beating, there is a lot of finger biting, there's a lot of testicle ripping, there's just a lot of unnecessary violence in...
Unnecessary. You think chimps are utilitarian, so they make the decision to engage in excessive violence for particular reasons. This must indicate hatred, right? Children will rip the wings off of insects, not even out of curiosity, just because it's there. They got a notion. Pull it off. And if you're in a group fighting a lone single individual of another group, you're not going to get the resistance that will force you to stop doing that. Why would they need to have a hatred, an intellectualized hatred of the other? Would it not be enough for them to simply lack empathy, which also requires a projection of a particular understanding of someone onto another? because you're not actually empathetic. You don't actually have a psychic relationship with other humans. Why wouldn't that simply be the case? Children who are not malicious at all will be brutal to animals because they don't have a concept of it. Do you know crabs can feel pain? Do you hate the crab when you boil it alive? You don't even think about it, do you? Do you think when you see these restaurants that will serve like live octopus, do you think it's because they take pleasure in torturing the octopus? I'm sure some people do. I'm sure some people find it interesting. I'm sure some people find it disturbing, but not disturbing enough to act upon. And I think that goes for a lot of people. Like case in point, like we'll talk about horrible things being done to humans all the time. There's very little attention paid to the fact that there are thousands upon thousands upon thousands upon thousands, millions even, millions of pain-sensitive animals being brutally tortured every single day and then murdered. I don't care. What if it's enough for them simply not to have a concept of caring that it feels pain, or even having a notion of others feeling pain? They respond to the external expressions. This is anthropomorphization. You are asserting a cruel intent based upon the superficial expression of whatever it is that they're doing. But cruelty is complex. Cruelty involves a conception of the other that you are violating deliberately in a particularly inefficient way for the purpose of maximizing the experience that you are simulating them having inside their own body. You forget some people do act upon it. A very big minority of them. Very small minority of them, I should say, not a big minority.
Affliction that is not needed to dispatch of the foreigner. There's torture, and perhaps uniquely among non-human animals.
Okay, but you gotta be careful though. Torture. There's torture. You know what would be really compelling for this argument? If the chimps, after torturing one of the opposing chimps, erected a monument with chimp skulls on it to ward off enemies. That would speak to, okay, there's something more abstract going on here, right? They aren't doing that though. They aren't we're not seeing chimp bone castles anywhere. We're not seeing chimps staking out their defeated foes. There's no iron throne of chimps, right? For a reason, because they're not motivated by cruelty. You are calling something cruel based upon how horrific you find it, but a child doesn't find it horrific when they rip the wings off of an insect, or when they bend the back of a snake in the wrong direction, or when they catch a frog and squeeze it or throw it or whatever, or when they toss it. Have you ever seen like a kid toss a cat? You have to tell them no. Kids will do that, or when they pull a cat's tail. Are they trying to hurt the cat? No, they see a thing to be pulled. Just chimps do that to cats too, by the way. There's a video you can find where I think it's like a raccoon or something got into like a chimp exhibit, some kind of animal like that, and the chimp's just grabbing it by its tail, just holding it. Is it trying to be cruel to the raccoon? No, it's interesting. It's like, huh. And I think there's another one where it's like, I think that same one actually, was it a chimp? It might have been a gorilla, but they just fling it over his head afterwards. You see a raccoon just go flying. Essential Salt's voice, war. Yeah, there you go.
This violence is not limited to strangers at the border. In bids to expand territory, chimpanzee patrols will push into neighboring communities where they will systematically hunt down and kill members of those communities. And to add to an already familiar picture, these chimpanzees will usually focus the killing on males and infants.
Right, once again, and now we have, again, like, look guys, this division of labor is natural, quote unquote. What we've observed in these chimps tells us how we are outside of society. It tells us how we are despite society. It tells us how we are eternally, irrespective of our current legal situation, our current political situation, our current social situation. This is not good. And once again, like Gutsick Gibbon, I do not think is a bad creator. Um, I think probably a lot of creators that I have a lot of respect for would fall into the same thing. I know Angela Collier does. I love Angela Collier's content. She's great. She's great. She's a great feminist leftist channel, as a matter of fact. Also falls into state of nature discourse. She doesn't realize it. She doesn't say state of nature. She falls into social contract discourse. Why does that matter? Well, because the social contract exists as an escape from nature. The understanding is that in nature, we agreed to what we now do. So that present institutions are justified by a certain right relationship to a natural contract, a contract made in nature, not in the necessary sense, not a contract with nature, a contract with each other. And so therefore our institutions are valorized because we consented to them primordially. The problem is that not only did we not consent to them primordially, we didn't even consent to them after we were in political communities. Political communities engaged in conquest and enslavement of each other, and in sexual subjugation, and so on. Sniff, sniff. Right? This lady is used to only being disagreed with by Christians, so she doesn't actually try very hard. I mean, in her defense, you don't really need to try very hard with those people. And they're worse. They are worse. They will say we are eternally warring because of our fallen, sinful nature. But they end up being very similar to each other in the end.
In hopes of integrating females into their own community. Lions do not do that. We do that. That's war. And to be a little bit more specific.
See? There it is. Lions don't do that. We do that. Chimps do that. We do that. It's the same thing. War is what chimps do. Chimps do what humans do by nature. War is eternal and natural. As is misogyny. And so on. See the problem?
Sometimes that's genocide. For those of you currently writing me an essay in the comment section about ants, please be sure to include the citation on ant testicle ripping. Ants do
Okay, that is poor reasoning. That is very poor reasoning. Ants will rip each other piece by piece. Ants do not experience, as far as we are aware, curiosity like some mammals do. Ants don't seem to engage in play. Chimps engage in play. Chimps will pick things apart, scratch things, chew things, taste things that are weird. Chimps will get drunk. Did you know that? They'll actually make their own booze. It's weird. Jimbo says, I mean, didn't Hobbes even say that before man entered into society, he lived in what he called the state of nature, which he defined as a war of all against all? Is he misusing the word war? Yes, he is. I talked about that earlier. He is. He does misuse it. Because you need to understand, Hobbes's Leviathan, its principal goal is not to provide a correct anthropology. Its principal goal is to convince you that the condition of being ruled over that you find yourself in is something that you consented to because it is a better situation than the state of nature, which is a state of war of all against all, right? Now, strictly speaking, a state of war of all against all can't be a state of war. It's actually a contradiction in terms because war is only between communities, definitionally, right? A war of all against all is a position of an open-ended melee between every single person as an individual. It's not between family groups. The existence of consistent family groups in a state of nature that are able to cohere and therefore engage in collective violence on each other's side would be a state of contract. This is something Michel Serres brings up. There are, even as a condition of having the language, the capacity to express with each other, the desire to enter into a certain normative relationship with each other requires there to be some level of consistency and connection that you can describe as contractual. To a certain extent, Serres actually rehabilitates social contract language in a way I rather like. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with its usage. I'm still on the fence about that. But this is the Rousseau critique of Hobbes. The individuality and the posture of violence towards and hostility towards other people is the result of society. In nature, we don't have the means to be interested in having that hatred of each other. It doesn't occur to us. You should see how liberal historians describe the Russian Civil War, war of all against all Zombies. Historians generally, not just liberal historians, will often, under the assumption that, well, these things are just obvious, will often use these terms from political science and political philosophy as a shorthand for describing the stuff that they're talking about. I talked about this on a previous stream. There's a book called The Rise and Fall of the Egyptian Empire. Sorry, The Rise and Fall of Ancient Egypt, which is just a baffling title, in which he describes the ancient Egyptian state. Which is a problem, because ancient Egypt pre-exists states by a long margin. There were no states at that time. Ancient anything, there are no states. Strictly speaking, what we call city-states often, very problematically in ancient Athens, were not states. They were political communities. They were not states.
Wage war, but they don't wage war like this. Chimpanzee war, like human war.
Wait, did she say ants wage war?
About ants, please be sure to include the citation on ant testicle ripping. Ants do wage war, but they don't wage war like this.
Ants don't wage war, and neither do chimps. I am sorry. You are using these terms sloppily, and you haven't interrogated what these things mean. And you should, because there's actually a wealth of very good in fact, work in the philosophy of nature and of science of nature by people who are very well respected in the field. People like Bruno Latour, Don Haraway, Anna Tsing, and so on. And you would get a lot out of it. You'd find it very enlightening and interesting, and even you, with no doubt your extensive knowledge of primatology, would find something to learn there. Highly recommend it. To let to aneurysm? What do you mean? Well, aneurysm is lazy. Like he's putting out slop these days. It's very frustrating.
Chimpanzee war, like human war, is predicated on complicated social interactions.
I have some regrets about. Before we go on to the Mearsheimer section, I'm going to talk a little bit about why I'm being harsh with aneurysm right now. But I have some regrets about endorsing his videos in the latest one I did, because I didn't realize they had gotten so bad. Because he's been pumping them out like on a weekly basis, and they're not good. They are very sloppy. And I would consider them to be anti-educational, actually, at this point. It's very frustrating.
That take place over weeks, or months, or years, or decades. Those interactions yield relationships between individuals, between small groups, between large groups, the intensity and nature of which determine if and when things.
At Captain Jumpy super chatted $10. I have a buddy falling down a Neoplatonist rabbit hole. Got any book recs that critique it and point in a more materialist, critical direction?
Oh boy. For him, I would go into Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morality. Seriously. I would go into Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morality, and I would use that. Learn the book and learn how to simplify it. Learn how to talk about it, familiarize yourself with that. That would be my first suggestion. I might also suggest there's a lot of really good feminist literature that looks into the social origins of separating the world into forms and into the matter that makes it up. Elizabeth Gross is very good for this. I cannot recommend enough her book Volatile Bodies. But I can't show you a copy of the cover because it has a full-on nude photograph on it. But it's very good. I might also recommend Bruno Latour, honestly. Bruno Latour's Politics of Nature. I'm not even kidding. I think we'll get a lot out of that. But like fundamentally, like how you would undercut that is simply by pointing out that the doubling of the world is itself based principally upon trying to find new space for worldly impulses to be moved. But that'd be about it. I have no patience for people who are sort of like shallowly going into like Neoplatonism and whatnot anymore these days. And I probably should have more patience, and I probably will regain it at some point. But it seems like a colossal waste of time, and people are generally moving into it as a cope for existential issues that they can't face. And it's something people need to be a little bit gutsier about, bluntly. Not in the sense of like you gotta man up or whatever, but in the sense of like if you're motivated towards buying into a philosophy because it makes you feel good, you're probably making a whole lot of other people really hurt, because you're doing stuff that isn't geared towards engaging with other people in the world. You're doing stuff that is geared towards distracting yourself from your anxieties. And that's not how you face and solve problems. That's not how you make yourself better. That's how you keep yourself from growing. And that's a lot of mystics and apologists these days. Bubble says, taking the most minute investigatory interest in the academic foundation Goodall entered into has set off alarm bells all over. The people who paid for her research were explicitly interested in drawing a line between the social behaviors of great apes and humans. I would hazard a skeptical consideration there, despite Leakey's other vaunted works. Okay.
Things get violent. Most humans are willing to sacrifice their life for a family member or for a close friend, members of that immediate in-group. But some humans across space and time have been willing to put their lives on the line for a much larger in-group, like their tribe or their country, which leads us to the second half of this in-group, out-group dynamic.
Oh no.
The out-group.
Oh no. No, Gutsick Gibbon, I am so sorry. Chimps don't have nations. Chimps do not have nationalisms. I'm sorry. You are not just anthropomorphizing these chimps, you are westernizing these chimps. You are Europeanizing these chimps. Gibbon, no. You're Gutsick Gibbon, not Edward Gibbons. Ugh. 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 Oh my god, silver play YouTube button. A word, we must take everything to say at face value. I mean, if I had a YouTube silver play button, I'd display it. So that's an accomplishment. I don't have an issue with that. That's a cool background, but like, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. No. No. Okay, so we're moving to like, we're psychologizing chimps as having an abstract hatred of the other that means that they are cruel. No. Yeah, finally we have colonized the savage apes, indeed. Actually, it's kind of the opposite. The savage apes have colonized our minds. We need to unpack our Oh god, this is so bad. She's been doing this a couple of times lately. It's very frustrating. And again, like, I don't think it's like nefarious or even lazy. It's because I don't think it occurs to people like this to even like interrogate these terms. I'm gonna put together a reading list for Gutsick Gibbon. Actually, I'm gonna address it to her. Like, that'll be aggravating. I should do that. That'll be interesting. I remember the last Gutsick Gibbon video I covered. We had a lot of really weird people who were very angry in the comments because they didn't understand what was being said. It's not her fault. It's a big YouTube channel, so it happens. But that'll piss off those people in the most fun way imaginable. What are we going to have in there? Let's make a list quickly off the top of our heads. Genealogy of morality. Why not? Okay. invention of morals, or so on and so forth. We'll do Stuart Eldon's The Birth of Territory for sure. Absolutely. Bruno Latour's Politics of Nature, 100%. And what else do we need? Carl Schmitt's The Nomos of the Earth. Actually, no, we'll do Carl Schmitt's. I like The Nomos of the Earth, though. I feel like that's better, because that also engages with territory. We'll do that one. And you know what? I'm going to do Christian Meyer's The Greek Discovery of Politics, which nobody has read. Sunday, could you share that reading list with general viewers? I just did, I believe. But I'll, yeah, that's going to be a YouTube video. I'm not going to send it to her. I'm going to publish it as a YouTube video. That's easy content. And it's the kind of easy content that I don't feel bad about. I had to read those books, goddammit. Do you have any idea how much work that was? I'm allowed to make lists as my content. Besides, I've got 2 big YouTube essays in the works right now. I've got one talking about Odyssey translations and the cultural politics around that. With the general underlying thesis that I don't think anybody's actually read this Emily Wilson translation. And then leaving that aside, I'm going to be doing the Angela Collier video is being worked on. I'm like 4 pages in. Actually, no, I think I'm like 6 pages in. And that's going to be 45 minutes to an hour. And that one's probably going to be recorded when I get back from my trip. And the Odyssey one might be recorded tomorrow, because I think I might be seeing the Odyssey tomorrow, finally. Yeah. But yeah, it'll be there.
It's been proposed before that while humans have a uniquely intense altruism for members of our in-group, we also have a uniquely intense hatred or disdain for members of our out-group. Like,
listen to the move she made. Humans. Listen to this. This is so bad. Again, no shade to Gutsick. I like her content, but this is like quintessentially what people like Latour were concerned about. Okay, listen to this.
In-group, like their tribe or their country, which leads us to the second half of this in-group out-group dynamic, the out-group. It's been proposed before that while humans have a uniquely intense altruism for members of our in-group, we also have a uniquely intense hatred or disdain for members of our out-group. Like, it's one thing to sacrifice your life to try to save someone you love, and it's another to sacrifice your life to hurt someone you hate. War in chimpanzees, and particularly those preemptive attacks.
See what she did? Humans. It has been proposed, to be fair. Humans have an intense relationship. Humans have that word humans, draw a circle around that. If you were to draw a assembly, imagine an assembly, if you will, right? Of all the humans in the world, all the groups of humans in the world, all chattering away, arguing with each other about what's important. And then you drew a circle around all of them, and then you made a copy, and you put that into the conversation as well. So now all of humanity now has to argue with all of humanity too. As a thing they now must take seriously. Right? When you draw a circle around something like humanity, politics, nature, society, etc., and you attribute to that particular logics, particular conditions, particular things that impinge upon the action of other things, in a certain sense, it's like you add a person to an assembly that therefore devalues the other voices in the assembly. This is one of the reasons why democracies were always extremely jealous of who could be a citizen and who couldn't. Because every time you add a citizen, that's one more person to disagree with you. Well, suppose, for example, you said, well, I think we should have a society that is organized according to these principles, but then human nature over here is coming in and saying, but hang on, we do war and we hate the outgroup and so on, so, we need institutions that accommodate me. Am I making sense? This is something that Bruno Latour talks about in The Politics of Nature. One of the reasons why Bruno Latour wants us to abandon the notion of nature is specifically because the notion of nature ends up being this giant behemoth in our discourse that dictates to us things that we have to take seriously. When in fact, what ostensibly we think we're referring to is just the rest of the world and just our situation in the world. It actually proposes a fixedness about the world and our situation in the world that we then have to constantly contend with and we cannot challenge. And so scientists, under this conception of nature, end up short-circuiting democracy, in Bruno Latour's words, in this way. They study the world as opposed to culture and as opposed to politics. They study the actual stuff, right? The actual stuff of existence. In Thunderfoot's incredibly arrogant phrase, they're having sex with the universe, right? And they derive facts from their experimentations that they can then deliver to the rest of humanity. Here's a fact. This is something you need to contend with. Here's a voice that speaks, right? The facts say otherwise. You want to do this, but that's not compatible with the facts. And the point isn't that scientists can't tell you things that you should take seriously and should navigate around and use in informing your decisions and your projects. The point is that proposed in that way, understood in that way, nature becomes essentially a thing that puts the lie to the idea that there actually is human discourse going on, there actually is collective decision-making, rather than the dominance by particular institutions over others.
or total wipeouts suggest a very familiar type of cognition as well as a familiar type of group identity to
Oh God, she's actually going all the way.
attacks or total wipeouts.
Listen to this.
To sacrifice your life to hurt someone you hate. War in chimpanzees, and particularly those preemptive attacks or total wipeouts, suggest a very familiar type of cognition as well as a familiar type of group identity.
They don't, actually. They don't. There's another book I'm going to add to that reading list called The Cultural Politics of Emotion by Sarah Ahmed. And one of the things that she will talk about is the way in which pain, as the sensation of the violation of a surface that is otherwise not felt, right? You at any given moment, you have sensitivity across your entire body, but you aren't thinking about it. You aren't aware of it. Most of your body you're not aware of, as a matter of fact, which is a very disturbing thought when you think about it too long, until you realize that, there's not actually any imperative to be aware of it, and awareness is itself a chemical reaction, so chill out, dude, it's okay. Life's weird. But pain is the result of a particular violation of space, a particular type of damage or pressure or impingement on particular organs that results in a reflexive action. That sense of violation requires there to be something there to register, either literally or in imagination, the point of violation, and for there to be a nervous apparatus that allows for a response. Right? So what's very crucial here is that group identity is something that can be violated, something that occupies space, is not something that comes to us innately. It's not a part of our cognition. It's a part of our culture. It's a part of our practices, actually, to be a bit more careful with it. It's a part of our habits that we have engaged in, not as a result of our nature, quote unquote, but as a result of our history. We don't have an innate sense of being part of a racial group. And you need to be really careful here because biologically, if we're invoking similar cognitions, unless you think that religion and politics pre-exist humans, you are probably going to be very dangerously close to valorizing racial politics. If you say that this in-group, out-group distinction is innate and like that, right? And this is where this becomes dangerous once again, because the issue here is not that we misunderstand chimps. The issue here is that chimps are being used as a way to understand us.
To that we see in ourselves. Primatologists have documented
Pain is the body signal there is damage that it thinks there is. The body doesn't think. It's not how that works. That's not how that works. Strictly speaking, thinking as a thing isn't really a thing. Like, thinking is itself is a way of compartmentalizing the activity of bodies whole cloth. There isn't, strictly speaking, a distinction between mind and the rest of your body. But leaving that aside, pain is not the way the body registers damage. We register damage intellectually through pain, but an organism doesn't necessarily have a notion of damage. They don't have a notion of integrity. Pain has an evolutionary advantage that it causes a revolt from that which we understand to damage the body. But we don't understand pain necessarily as being damage to the body, which is one of the reasons why, for example, people will scratch themselves to the point of bleeding, and they won't tell when it changes from satisfying an itch to pain. And they don't register damage when it's pain, they just stop doing it because it's uncomfortable.
Chimpanzees risking their lives to help individuals they aren't even related to, but who are a part of their group. And likewise, they've documented chimpanzees systematically torturing and killing individuals who are complete strangers to their community.
And we've completely gone from like, oh, look, we've observed these creatures in a inefficient way maiming members of another group. Therefore, we are licensed to infer that this is based upon cruelty, and therefore we can infer that they have a similar type of group identity in common with humans who will engage in performative cruelty against members of the other national groups, say. And you create this two-way street, this conduit between chimp culture, human culture, and you get to explain one by reference to the other. You should talk to Maud about this. I'd be happy to. Finally, something to talk about with Maud, honestly. Again, racism is literally caused by an instinct that makes us want to eliminate competitors for resources who aren't genetically closely related to us. That is wrong, Titan. That is actually very wrong. The notion of race doesn't even exist in antiquity. You got to be really careful there. You got to be really careful. No, racism is because of a notion, an abstract notion of cultural identity by dint of a registered notated descent. Race doesn't refer to groups. Race originally refers to descent. That's why you will find books called The Races of Plants, The Races of Fish, etc., hundreds of years ago, because they understood race as referring to descent. We understood the race referring to humans, referring to us as the descendants of Adam, right? I assume she's referring to an actual study. She may very well be. The problem, though, is that, A, she's not citing an actual study, but B, the study would be methodologically fraught because it is understanding chimps through the framework. We don't think of it as race until we're taught to, but the actual instinct is there. No, it's not, actually. The instinct is not there. This is why children of different races will hug each other and chill out. By the way, instinct is not an explanatorily useful term. What do you think an instinct is? Where is it located? In the gene? Does the gene think? This is where Susan Ayama would help you. There are no instincts. Seriously, go. We should do a big reading group on Susan Ayama sometime. That'd be great. When I get back, I'm going to start engaging with the GSL until we get it to monetization. I'm going to start streaming there. We'll do some Susan Ayama stuff. That'll be good. That'll be good for this talk. The homunculoid gene needs to go. We're going to keep going until 9 p.m. on this, and then I'm going to, which is in 25 minutes, and then I'm going to disappear for a few minutes, and we're going to do the John Mearsheimer segment after. But yeah, like, no, race is not an ancient concept. The idea of, that's incorrect. I'm sorry. I like you, Titan, but that's incorrect.
Okay, so in a rather unflattering blow to human...
An instinct is a neurologically hardwired behavior. A neurologically hardwired behavior. Now that's very interesting. A neurologically hardwired behavior. Well, that would suggest that a white child, upon seeing a black child, would be innately hostile. That's what you're saying. And if there is no instinct of the sort I'm talking about, then I sure wasted a lot of time studying primatology 40 years ago. Primatology 40 years ago engaged in this kind of error all the time. Explains a lot. Organisms engage in behaviors out of the womb. We need to be very careful about the notion of instinct, because this essentially implies that you can understand that behavior by dint to a structure within the organism alone, and not by reference to, for example, the way in which that organism forms a system with its surround, that its components are placed to have that result with, right? So humans do not have group identity out of the womb. We need to develop that. The subject of race is fraught with concern with the colonial understanding of race. There may be a biological context underlying that, but it has been forever corrupted by those thinkers. No, there's not a biological underpinning for racism. It's not there. Not even with race.
In exceptionalism, we find that tribalism and xenophobia and war and...
Oh no, see, look. And this is the problem too, and this is why it short circuits democracy in Latour's argument. So the scientist has gone forward. They have derived the facts from nature and have delivered them unto us, and now they can use them as a point of contact for. It's like, look, stop trying to argue that xenophobia is the way of nature, please. That is foolish. Like, that's just very fool. Like, we're going so far afield from primatology here. Like, you're not even talking about primates anymore. You're using this as a byway to do anthropology. But you didn't do any anthropology. You just took your folk understanding of anthropology from memes, from the internet, and from media, and you just used primatology to valorize them, which is silly.
Their community. Okay, so in a rather unflattering blow to human exceptionalism, we find that tribalism and xenophobia and war and genocide are not unique to our species, and in fact, we find them in one of our closest living relatives. That was decades ago. So the chimpanzees are doing another war. We've seen that before.
Okay, so Gutsick, you debate with religious people all the time, so you will be aware, for example, of homophobia amongst the religious. What is frequently pointed out to religious people in these contexts is that, well, actually, these supposedly innocent, created by God organisms outside of humanity, they also engage in homosexual copulation. Are you saying that xenophobia is okay? You see the problem? That's the relationship between these 2 points. By dividing the world into nature and politics, you treat what is found out here by people within politics as more fixed than what happens in here. And so the scientist goes out, constructs facts, brings them back. The construction of the facts is hidden, and then nature becomes politically slanted, valorizing some positions and demoting others. Which political positions are in greater conformity to nature? Case in point, if racism is an instinct, well, that's a problem, because now our institutions have to take into account the constant omnipresence of racism as something that human beings are born with, right? And anyone who argues that that isn't the case, that racism is not innate, well, now they are demoted as being unscientific. They are not responding appropriately to the facts. President Sunday, even if we as academics know better, our research can be misinterpreted really by bad faith actors who must be absolutely rigorous. We need to be humble and skeptical internally to an extreme that I don't think many of us are willing to be, and it's very frustrating that people in this zone are basically rendered artificially more arrogant than I think they actually are, because they are constantly arguing against people who are also arrogant in the other direction. I think Gutsick Gibbon has spent too much time arguing with very dumb theistic people, and she needs to start taking philosophy of science and feminist philosophy a lot more seriously, because she's making errors here that actually valorize the other bad guy in the room, which is the reactionaries who want to insist that yes, as we've been saying, race is innate. It's a part of how human identity works. It's about how human groups form, and we need to make sure that we are taking that into account when we decide who is allowed where. You see how dangerous this becomes.
What's new about this one? Well, the Kivali Chimpanzee War was larger, extensively documented, beginning to end, and thus offers some tantalizing clues as to why chimpanzee wars happen in the first place, why ape wars happen at all. This new paper's title is Lethal Conflict After Group Fission in Wild Chimpanzees. And that word fission should be familiar to you because within every chimpanzee group, there are fissions and there are fusions. So, what this title is immediately telling you is that there is lethal conflict after a group split. But I just got done telling you, amongst many other things, that chimpanzee social systems are characterized in part by frequent splits and then joining back together. So what's different? What changed? Why did this split lead to death? This paper is not open access, so I'm going to do a lot of summarizing, and I'm only going to...
Someone find me this paper. Someone find me it. We can probably get it on Anna's archive. I don't care about copyright. Go get it.
To show figures or paragraphs when I feel that they are necessary to properly communicate this science. We begin, as always, with the abstract here. They say territorial
What an ominous way to phrase that.
conflicts in animals can inform aspects of human warfare, but civil war, with its shifting group identities, or I'll add here, shifting in-groups and out-groups.
Territorial conflicts in animals can inform aspects of human warfare. Can inform aspects of human warfare. Now, there's two possibilities. This is a very poorly written paper by someone who has confused inform with resemble, because territorial conflicts in animals should not inform aspects of human warfare generally. I'm not entirely sure what aspects they would be thinking of, but civil war with its shifting group identities has not been previously observed. That following sentence makes me think that they meant to say resemble when they said inform, because that sentence is very wrong. But the thing is that you don't have a civil war just because you have in-group fighting. Intra-group fighting is not civil war, except as a heuristic, as a metaphor. There's a civil war in the Magic the Gathering community. Something like that. Is there an actual civil war? No. There's no civitas. They aren't in a civil relationship with each other.
Have not been previously observed.
I suspect she meant inform our understanding of. Well, they shouldn't inform our understanding of human warfare either, because they shouldn't. Hang on. Oh god. Oh no, I think Titan's right. We report a rare permanent fission in the largest known group of wild chimpanzees using 30 years of behavioral observation and network analyses. We describe a transition from cohesion to polarization in 2015 and the emergence of two distinct groups by 2018. Over the next 7 years, members of one group made 24 attacks, killing at least 7 mature males and 17 infants in the other group. These findings indicate that group identities can shift and escalate into lethal hostility in one of our closest living relatives in the absence of the cultural markers often thought necessary for human warfare. This is one of the reasons why I'm starting to have a deep prejudice against primatologists in general. Not because primatology is not an incredibly important and interesting field of study, and a lot of people do it very well, but because it seems like a lot of people are really only interested in primatology as a way to short-circuit anthropology. You don't need to do the difficult work of understanding human history and our institutional development, the long arbitrary sequence of decisions and accidents and inventions that's largely very difficult to track and often impossible to track, very inconveniently. No, we can just look at our close primate ancestors, our close primate relatives, and go well, look, they're more primitive than us, right? They don't have institutions like we do. So if they're doing this, this must be what we do before institutions. This must be just how we are. It's extraordinarily damaging. And who benefits from this, by the way, to be clear, are not the feminists or the liberals or the progressives or the leftists. It's the right-wingers, who now have a fixed human nature to lean on, valorized by scientists, to be able to argue in favor of their institutional preferences. I linked the article in the GSL. Wonderful. I can't access it because I'm not on Discord, because I don't have Discord on this computer. So we'll use that when we get back and I make the video critiquing this.
We report a rare permanent fission, or splitting apart, of the largest known group of wild chimpanzees,
By the way, a rare permanent fission? What do you mean? How do you know it's permanent? How do you know it's what is the basis for saying it's permanent? Are you a fortune teller? That's projecting it into the future.
troglodytes, using 30 years of behavioral observations and
I'm going to make a big video essay on apes don't go to war, okay? We finally have someone reasonably respectable to make that response to.
network analyses, we describe a transition from cohesion to polarization in 2015 and the emergence of two distinct groups by 2018. So they're saying across 3 years, they watched the largest observed chimpanzee community become polarized towards one another. Attitudes towards individuals within this group went from sweet to sour, and that was followed.
Long-term doesn't mean permanent. Permanent doesn't mean long-term. Permanent means unceasing. That is what permanent means. It is a state of affairs that will not change, that will not end.
Followed by a complete and permanent splitting of those two groups. They go on to say, over the next 7 years.
By the way, August, are you guys going live on the GSL tonight? Is there a GSL stream in the works tonight? Should I be rating into you, or should I be rating to somebody else when we're done? I still have another segment, so we're not ending soon, but it would be good to know, so I'm rating into somebody who's doing good stuff, as opposed to,
Years, members of one group made 24 attacks, killing at least 7 mature males and 17 infants in the other group. These findings indicate that group identities can shift and escalate into lethal hostility in one of our closest living relatives in the absence of cultural markers often thought necessary for human warfare.
Cultural markers thought necessary for human warfare. So strange. What strange language. The cultural markers thought necessary for human warfare. No, you need institutional organizations of humans that can legally initiate a official state of hostility towards another legal group. That's what you need. Or a concept. You can even have a war, for example, on terror, as George Bush did. You can have a posture of war towards something like that, but you need that legal institution to begin with. You need a declaration. You need policy, right? Now, Bush's conception is problematic for various reasons. I don't think that's a very risky thing to say. George Bush's conception of things is problematic, but you get the general problem here. You need a formal legal institution that is capable of having an institutional attitude towards another institution. War is between institutions. War is not just conflict. War is not just violence. Cruelty is not just violence. Cruelty is not just inefficient violence. So much has been packed in here. Efficiency is therefore the sign of the biological, and cruelty and inefficiency is the sign of the cultural. Very strange. Almost Aristotelian, isn't it? The idea that nature, quote-unquote, is efficient. Very strange. Very strange. 3-month-old article. It's that recent, huh? I didn't look at the date. It's in the GSL, though, so if you join the Gay Science Laboratory, which for some reason is not linked in the description, then you can August, can you post a link to the GSL in the chat, please? Can you have a war on terror? What's the end state when it is done? Well, presumably no more terror, right?
Split sometimes, often because
it's one of the problems with it. It's one of the reasons why someone like Carl Schmitt would have an issue with it, because having a war on a concept or having a war on a practice means that war basically is unconditional. There's no point of a return to normalcy. The state of exception becomes prolonged into a basically permanent state.
because they get too large, but rarely is this splitting overtly violent. But in humans specifically, groups often fission because of social tension, from internet communities to ancient nations, and those social tensions can...
Oh God. I'm sorry, every single time she does this.
Specifically, groups often fission because of social tension.
Sunday, I just got my copy of The Gay Science and the Spine is Total Garbo. Which edition did you get? Some of them are pretty bad. Nietzsche, unfortunately, does not have a lot of nice editions.
From internet communities.
Sorry, we gotta go back. Like, once again, this becomes entirely about anthropology. Why aren't we still talking about the Chimp Civil War? Because you're talking about civil war between humans and you're using chimps as a way to pretend that you've studied Civil War. That's like, just to be blunt.
do split sometimes, often because they get too large, but rarely is this splitting overtly violent. But in humans specifically, groups often fission because of social tension, from internet communities to ancient nations, and those social tensions can and
Ancient nations. What's an ancient nation? What are you talking about? Do you know why Benedict Anderson, who is a problematic theorist in his own right, wrote a book called Imagined Communities? It's precisely because we needed a technological explanation for why it was that in modernity we identify with vast groups of people that we didn't identify with before in the abstract, not based on one-to-one relationships, not based on people you've ever actually seen. When you're talking about the nation, you got to be careful. Are you talking about a line of descent? That's what nations used to refer to, by the way. That's what ethnic groups used to refer to, lines of descent. It didn't refer to tribes writ large with a spatialized existence. Cambridge Press got a green cover. Yeah, it sounds like it was printed by Amazon. That's going to be print on demand. Don't get Cambridge books from Amazon anymore. Get them used, preferably, from 10 years ago off of Abe Books, which is still Amazon, but they're all used.
Often do lead to violence. But if our model for lethally violent group fission comes from our own species, then it comes loaded with the reasons for those social tensions, which are usually due to—
Wait, say again?
If our model for lethally violent group fission comes from our own species, then it comes loaded with the reasons for those social tensions, which are usually due to things like religious differences or preferences.
I'm sorry, I need to hear this one more time. From the beginning.
Lead to violence. But if our model for lethally violent group fission comes from our own species, then it comes loaded with the reasons for those social tensions, which
I don't understand what she's saying here. I actually don't understand what she's saying.
often because they get too large, but rarely is this splitting overtly violent. But in humans specifically, groups often fission because of social tension, from internet communities to ancient nations, and those social tensions can and often do lead to violence. But if our model for lethally violent group fission comes from our own species, then it comes loaded with the reasons for those social tensions, which are usually due to things like religious differences or preferences in governing systems.
Do religious systems and preferences in governing... I'm sorry, do religious differences come from our species? What? What are you talking about?
Lethally violent group fissions or civil wars happen in humans because a group of individuals within a larger group doesn't like the way things are going and they want things to change. And they resolve either to take over the larger group by force or try to leave, and the larger group doesn't like that. Either way, there's going to be blood. Since doesn't like the
No, it's not because they don't like... This is... Okay. It's not because the large group doesn't like that. Specifically, you have a breakdown of the legal system such that the traditional authority doesn't exist anymore. There is a challenge for authority, for the identity of the community itself. Which means there is an abstract notion of the community that pre-exists this. It is the identity of the community that is at stake. It is not simply a desire... It is not simply a desire to kill or to be independent of at a merely effective level, right? So August QC is reading the article right now. And he writes, war and other forms of collective violence have shaped human societies for millennia, yet their origins and mechanisms are debated. A prominent line of research suggests that ethnicity, religion, language, and other cultural markers anchor group identities and motivate cooperation within groups and hostility toward outsiders. That's from the article. I'm reading the article and I'm noticing she's doing very little original analysis. A lot of this is just summarizing the article's view. Well, that's disappointing. That's lazy. It's also very, once again, common amongst evopsych and primatology groups, which for obvious reasons have a lot of overlap. How we outgroup our anthropomorphization loads the understanding of how chimps wage war, which is invalid. No. That's the kind of a... Can you say that again? Like complete... Wait. She is a smarty. How we outgroup our anthropomorphization loads the... You need to rewrite that. I can't understand the comment you're making.
The way things are going historically in humans usually revolves around governance or religion. Can we see a civil war in a non-human animal, in non-human apes? This paper demonstrably shows us that
no, because they don't have an understanding of being part of a civil community.
But the answer to that question is yes. You don't need a human type of culture to have a civil war. And what that suggests is that civil war is older than Homo sapiens.
Oh my god, she just does it. No, it doesn't. Jesus Christ. Civil War is not older than Homo sapiens.
At Thumbdump and the Bump Chump super chatted $5. She's implying that there's a platonic, true, reason communities break down separate from cultural reasons.
Well, specifically, you put your finger on something. The natural as a category, nature as a category, facilitates this sort of Platonic view of things where there is this underlying logic to be found in nature as an explanation for all human activities. This is one of the reasons why evopsych is so problematic. Evopsych in theory should be like extremely important and interesting, because elements of our psychology are absolutely evolved. Elements of them are conditioned by experience, and actually these are continuous with each other. But here's the main point. Evopsych tries to essentially Oedipalize our current institutions by locating them in a genealogical past, so that we have a sort of a great chain of being explanation for our behavior. Why do we engage in civil war? Because of these primordial elements of our psychology. The problem, though, is that we engage in civil war actually because we have civil institutions that arrange us in particular ways that make for particular types of violence that take into account those institutions, which allow for scopes of violence and ambitions of violence far beyond what what another primate would think of doing. Right? They also allow for cruelty. You need to have a concept. You need to have a concept of psychology, a concept of how affect works to be cruel in that way. I don't think these apes are cruel. I think these apes are playing. They're playing. Cruelty is very complex. But children, pay attention to what children do. Children will pick the wings off of insects. They will pull the tails of cats. They'll sit on pets, right? Are they trying to be cruel? No. They're playing. They don't have a concept of empathy. Empathy is developed. Children will be cruel to other kids in the same way. When a baby slaps you, are they trying to be cruel? No. When a baby's nursing and bites their mother, are they being cruel? No.
And in fact, because it's found in chimpanzees, assuming it's not convergent, it's probably at least as old as our last common ancestor.
No, this is like a basic failure of critical thinking. This is a basic failure of critical thinking. You should know better. I'm gonna make those two videos. I'm gonna do the reading list. And I'm gonna do a video response to this because this needs a response. This is really bad. This is a really bad video. Did we inherit the war gene? Apparently, we inherited the war gene. That's what's going on here. And the problem is this: I fucking love science community eats this stuff up because they don't actually think about what gets loaded into scientific discourse, like methodology. People think of methodology as the literal manner in which you arrange your test tubes, okay? They think about it like, what's the thing you're doing in the lab with your fingers? A more important question sometimes is, what is it that you're doing with your language? There are ways to be statist or sexist or what have you in your methodology. There are ways to be anthropomorphic in your methodology. So, for example, if you insist on breaking apart the world into components that equivocate between the behaviors of animals and institutions, then there is a methodological institutionalism in your analysis. If you insist upon, for example, like suppose we weren't going with war, suppose we went with states. Look, these chimps are organized in a hierarchy with an in-group and an out-group, and they patrol territory. Therefore, our propensity to form states is at least as old as our last common primate ancestor. Potentially. That would be obviously wrong. Obviously wrong. But it's the exact same move. We'll give her 5 more minutes, then I'm going to take a break, and then we're going to come back and do the John Mearsheimer segment.
Which means apes have been doing civil war for potentially 7 million years. So if human-style culture isn't required for a civil war, then what is? Why did these...
Not even just human-style culture is required for a civil war. Not even human culture is sufficient for a civil war. Not even human culture is sufficient for a civil war. You need the civil part. You can't just say in-group fighting, therefore civil war. That's not enough. Civil war is more specific than that. This is why, for example, once again, when there is mob violence in the street because of a sports dispute, we do not call that civil war. Because the rebelling party has not constituted itself legally as a competing community attempting to reform the politics of that state's space. Strictly speaking, civil war doesn't really make sense as a concept because it presumes the continued existence of a state of normalcy over a state that is already in conflict with itself existentially between two different parties that do not identify as one. Which means at the moment of civil war, this is where Hobbes is correct, you don't have a civitas to be in civil war anymore. You have two. You have two states fighting now, or two political communities fighting. But I'm sorry, no. But this is one of the reasons why people end up endorsing essentially conservative politics, even though they think, they're liberal, progressive, they're not homophobic and all that stuff. But they've packed in human practices, violent human practices, that are not the result of us being human, they're the result of our history. Now, with an alternative history, we could possibly do similar things anyways, right? But that doesn't matter. The type of violence that we perform is based upon the types of things that we consider to exist that are capable of being violated. So if we do not consider, for example, the existence of peoples as an abstract entity, we will not have a notion of violence between racial groups or ethnic groups or national groups or what have you. We won't target them collectively because the collection, the line around them hasn't been drawn. Even if we kill everybody in a certain region, as sometimes has happened in the past. It doesn't mean they have a notion of race because they do that. It doesn't mean they have a notion of religion because they do that. Sometimes it's because they occupied the space and they wanted to clear out the space of enemies. Right? I guess how would you have her use terms? I think we all know that chimps don't have a legislative branch, though. Good critique. I've given some examples before. We would say we observe groups of chimps forming subgroups. These groups conflict with each other under particular conditions which appear to be related to scarcity, possibly to frictions between personalities in the group. And they seem to patrol certain regions of space and to expand the patrolled region of space under certain conditions and to engage in extreme violence against chimps from specific other groups as they expand that space and they encounter other chimps within that space. That's all. You don't load in institutional language that therefore risks valorizing human institutions as primordial, because it is a very common practice historically, and actually going back to antiquity, to try to valorize human institutions by reference to their age. This is one of the reasons why Athenian plays often talk about the origins of democratic and institutional systems, like the judiciary, right? They had a judiciary, but like judges, the referring of revenge to a legal body. That's the Eumenides. If you've read the Oresteia, it's a thing that is done very frequently, and for radically different reasons. They had a fetish for age. Period. They respected the old, but we respect the natural. We think in evolutionary terms, and so we think, oh, what accounts for the biological material that civilization has to work with after it comes out of a state of nature? Because we tend to think that way. We think that evolution stopped. Change stopped at the point that we put up fences and entered into our houses and lit fires. Wrong-o. Very wrong. But by treating nature as this fixed outer thing separate from us, We get to treat it as something to verify statements made by us. Oh, war is always here. War is here to stay. War is something we just do. It's not a thing that, for example, we could make institutional correctives for. It's just always there. The problem is that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the inevitability of war means the inevitability of always having to have a posture of war.
Chimpanzee.
If war is always there, then you always have the impetus, the need to win the war, so that you can institute more benign rules.
These fission so violently, so lethally. The paper, responsibly I think, outlines several reasons as to why this lethal group fission, why this civil war might have occurred. But in my opinion, for whatever that's worth, one reason sort of sticks out.
Good. We don't need to go through the paper. I just want to hear her reason, and then we're going to wrap it up.
I'm going to sort of work up to it, though. First, this chimpanzee community in Uganda, the Ngogo community, was just too big. 200 plus individuals as a part of the larger community. That's significantly larger than any other chimp community being studied at present. That's a lot of relationships to maintain. And although there are smaller subgroups within it,
if this brings to mind a lot of white nationalist arguments against mass immigration, you're not alone.
This is still the larger population of individuals that are more or less friendly towards one another. A lot to keep track of. That enormous group size alone is enough to explain a fission, but it doesn't really explain the lethality. Number two, as a reason for a fission, might help with that though, because it has to do with a shakeup in power. A new alpha male had risen up the ranks to be the most dominant individual out of all 200 plus chimps, and that is enough to make anyone anxious. And this is because, while across the primate order, linear dominance hierarchies in males, in females, and combined differ, in chimpanzees, who is top dog is determined by physical fights. It's determined by beating the crap out of each other. And specifically, it's determined by groups of chimpanzees vying for those top positions, not just one individual versus one additional individual. That means there is a lot of schmoozing, there's a lot of alliance forming, there's a lot of coalitionary attacks between groups of males and sometimes groups of females as well. And who is top dog isn't determined just by who is the strongest, but by who has the most support. So fights for the top position involve many chimpanzees and a whole lot of fighting. But that happens all the time in every single chimpanzee community we've ever studied. Hierarchies are not permanent, especially amongst the males, so that doesn't explain it. No, this chimpanzee civil war was not caused by the deposition of one important individual, but rather the happenstance deaths of many others. Do you remember how in high school there were a lot of different cliques that were interested in different things? If you have psychologically blocked out high school...
I too remember when the goths and the music students all fought to the death in the lunchroom with their fists.
To protect your own mental well-being. First of all, I get it. Just imagine here any high school sitcom. Those sitcoms usually have...
Are they also certain of this? Because people in primatology very rarely actually engage with people in political science or in history, and it's a really big problem, or in anthropology or in sociology. And so they end up just doing sociology and anthropology and political science really badly, because their only point of reference is they studied apes and they had a bunch of notions of how humans are in their heads.
Have like the athletes, the jocks, and then you've got the nerds or the academically inclined, and then there's the theater kids and the band geeks, and you might have the gamers or the goth kids, whatever. There are a bunch of different cliques, and they're composed of individuals who are interested in that clique's given subject. But there are also individuals that are a part of multiple different cliques, or that migrate between them, or that have no clique at all, but know people in various groups. In a simplistic way, they keep the lines of communication open between these groups that would otherwise grow further and further apart as they invested deeper into their given interest and no other interest. There are people that bridge the gap between cliques, the linchpins that hold together the larger group by connecting.
There's a great paper I'm also going to recommend by Ian Hacking called The Invention of Human Types. I think that's what it's called. The Invention of human types. The looping effect of humankind. Sorry, making up people. Here we go. The book is the article is Making Up People, and it's right here. You can find it online. Highly recommend it. Maybe we'll go through it, not tonight, but maybe tomorrow. Yeah, maybe we can go through it tonight after we're done the Mearsheimer section. We can do that. That'd be a good theory segment.
The smaller ones. In a high school, if you remove these bridge individuals, then cliques just further atomize from one another. The show choir doesn't systematically hunt down and dismember the band, we hope. But in chimpanzee communities, individuals are competing for access to resources and to mates. If they atomize, then they become strangers. Their in-group gets smaller, and members that are no longer within their in-group become the out-group.
Just like incels, oh my god.
They become potential competitors, and thus they become enemies. Figure 1 reveals that this is exactly what happened in the massive Ngogo chimpanzee community. It says, network and spatial separation precedes a shift from association to violence. And you can see that in 2014, individuals represented by these colored nodes here are all connected to one another, either directly or more commonly through intermediary individuals. But as 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, and eventually 2018 come to pass, we see that these groups are teased apart from one another as critical individuals that previously connected them die. This paragraph in the discussion outlines it even more clearly. They say 3 additional factors may have acted as catalysts for the split. First, the major network shift was preceded by the death of 5 adult males and 1 adult female in 2014. The causes of their deaths are unknown, but 2 individuals exhibited clinical signs of illness, raising the possibility that some died from disease. The loss of individuals, even weakly connected nodes, can disrupt social networks. These deaths, representing more than 10% of the mature males, may have weakened social ties across clusters and contributed to the increased modularity in 2015. So from 2013 to...
Okay, so you know what's coming to the fore here? These are, strictly speaking, if we take this at face value, this is describing the mechanism of a shift in group behavior and group dynamics, which means invoking cruelty and sort of a national consciousness, kind of group consciousness at that level, doesn't work. Because you're not supplying the technologies for generating an abstract conception of the group, a familiar conception of the group, if you will, or conceptions of, or psychological predispositions towards cruelty, psychological technologies that allow for cruelty, that allow for the imagining of cruelty. You're simply pointing to the breakdown of group cohesion at a behavioral level, which doesn't account for what you're trying to explain. Because now you have to account for the existence of a sense of being a part of a group, as an entity that is innately hostile towards outgroups, but within members of a group. But why would it only happen at that scale? Because there are different cliques even within these cliques. Two of them hang out with each other more than they hang out with these ones. What's the deal here? This is just extraordinarily bad. It's extraordinarily bad. Breakfast Club anthropology. That is dark but apt.
2015, several critical individuals died, which separated out these nodes and sort of set the stage for the eventual fission, and especially for the violence that came with it. Second,
for the how for the violence? You said it was cruelty. You said it was because of the that doesn't make any sense. Why would that contribute necessarily to the increase in violence? Why would these be related? Are we just not going to ask that? Like, seriously? You're trying to do the psychological study of other organisms. You can't just assume. You can't just like leap from like, oh well look, maybe that's why they made a parliament. What?
A change in the alpha male in 2015 coincided with the first sustained separation between members of the Western and Central clusters. Changes in the dominance hierarchy can increase aggression and avoidance in chimpanzees. At Ngogo, both the outgoing and ingoing alpha were a part of the Central cluster, although the incoming alpha had been a part of the Western cluster before rising up the dominance hierarchy.
This is what Wood-Defaultist does. This is what Wood-Defaultist does. I was going to make a video about called What Makes Wood-Defaultist Tick a little while ago, and I should do it now actually. But it was precisely about this. This is exactly the kind of analysis that Wood-Defaultist does. He assembles a toolbox of black boxes and then just superimposes that over a map. What do we have here? We have mapped out the relations between chimps, and we're just imposing memified understandings of human institutions to explain it based on the shape. This is extraordinarily bad science. It's actually not science at all. This is actually pure ideology at this point.
Although an alpha male change alone does not explain why the Ngogo group split, it may have amplified tensions between the two clusters. And then they continue on, since we already covered that, to a third factor may have contributed to the fission. In January 2017, a respiratory epidemic killed 25 chimpanzees.
Freud would love this. It's probably Freud's fault to some extent.
Including 4 adult males and 10 adult females.
I mentioned that this is Oedipalizing human institutions. What I mean by this is, and this is what Deleuze and Guattari talk about in Anti-Oedipus. Freud attributed, and psychoanalysis in general attributes complexes, mental and personal issues and whatnot that human beings have, to relationships with key individuals in their past, which are believed to simply be the root of behaviors now. And so rather than, for example, looking at the actual human being as a situation of certain connections around themselves, a certain relationship of connections within themselves, you look at them as like being the end of a chain of dominoes leading back to their relationships with their parents. But that's not actually how organisms exist. We are not records playing the tune of our relationship with our parents. That history is important, but actually we're situations that make no distinction between past and present, because our past is simply our present. Memory is in the present. We are a network of affective connections, of libidinal connections in some people's terminologies. And you understand the psychology of an entity by looking at how it's connected to the things around it, not by its past.
Although this occurred after polarization was already underway, it may have hastened the final separation. 2 of the adult males that died were a part of the Western cluster, and one of them was among the last individuals to connect the 2 groups. Taken together, these events suggest how networks may fracture in the face of multiple demographic and social changes. The reason human civil war is tied to human-specific culture is because that culture is how we outline our identities and how...
Culture, by the way, works the same way as nature does. There's this notion that there is the natural state of humans. Descola's book, Beyond Nature and Culture, would be good here, even though it's got some problematic bits in it. There's this notion that there is a fixed homogeneous nature, which comprises also the human resource that becomes like the humanity that becomes civilizations, and then on top of it there are different cultures that are simply reactions to that homogeneous nature, all forgetting that the conception of nature as apart from us is a cultural construct, is the product of a particular culture, understood here as the particular practice of particular groups of people that have simply become hegemonic, which, by the way, is how evolution works in general. Certain practices that are capable of reproducing more than others choke out the competition and become predominant. That's all.
How we oftentimes form or reinforce our relationships. But chimpanzees still have those relationships. They just...
So do humans. I'm sorry. You think humans don't have... Wait, what? Oh, shit. What did I do?
Networks may fracture relationships. They just form or reinforce human-specific culture is because that culture is how we outline our identities and how we oftentimes form or reinforce our relationships.
So culture is how we form or reinforce our relationships. What is the culture? Is that not a relationship? What? Because if it's not, if it's an abstraction, then no, that's wrong. Actually, they don't inform or reinforce our relationships. They actually act solely to disincline relationships. That's their function. They're tools of exclusion. They don't create relationships with other people, because I got some news for you. You don't relate to other people based upon having a conception of being part of a common race. You relate to people based on wanting to kick the immigrants out. That's what makes you march. You didn't give a shit about each other until that point.
But chimpanzees still have those relationships. They just form and reinforce them through chimpanzee cultural means. Just like humans, chimpanzees form...
There's another factor here which I didn't get into because it seems kind of petty, but like, these populations of chimpanzees are very small, like to the tune of hundreds at most. There is a point at which the large numbers of humans engaged in conflict actually does change the nature of how that conflict is played out and the way in which we conceptualize the enemy and the friend. And this adds an additional factor here, which is these are numbers of organizations that even if we allowed for chimpanzees to have the same psychology as humans, would be foreclosed to them because they don't have those numbers. 200 people, 200 is not a lot. You can visualize 200. You can imagine a room filled with 200.
Cliques based off of personalities and preferences, and these cliques are connected to other such cliques to form a larger community, in part by individuals that bridge them. If you take away the individuals that bridge these smaller groups, the groups atomize and begin to compete.
And this is very sloppy too, because the article suggested this as a proposal. She's stating it as a fact. But it's not a fact. This is a suggestion. Like, so you read an article that said, maybe it's this, and you said, see, look, it's this. No. No, the article is problematic. But the article wasn't asserting anything as fixed, as established. You're doing that. This is bad. Why are these people doing this? Why are you doing... How about you've got a successful YouTube channel, okay? You've got a lot of people following you. What if you did good science? What if you led by example and showed people how to do science well? Why can't we do that?
And if they begin to compete, things get violent. As illustrated here in Figure 2, the enormous chimpanzee community at Ngogo could be broken down into two smaller subgroups, the cliques of which knew one another. But
hang on, I'll be right back. Give me a second. We're going to take a quick break. 5 minutes. All right, let's wrap this up, and we'll get to the Mearsheimer section. Let's see what her thesis is. What's her explanation of ape war? Why are these apes going to war?
as the familiarity between these two subgroups, rather the cliques that made them up, was severed due to the deaths of the individuals that bridged them.
I missed the beginning. Is she a right nationalist? No, Gutsick Gibbon is a nice person. I like her content. She's a primatologist. This type of thinking is endemic to primatology. Its pretensions as a field beyond its scope. And it's a really big problem. And to be clear, primatologists aren't the only ones who do this. Hell, Jordan Peterson did this with lobsters, okay?
They started to tease apart. Without the critical individuals that facilitated the interaction between cliques which otherwise wouldn't have hung out together.
You know who else you should read, actually? Lynn Margulis. She'll get a lot out of Lynn Margulis. Lynn Margulis is great. Susan Oyama is great.
Cliques began to grow estranged. Estrangement leads to fear, and fear leads to violence.
Violence leads to the dark side.
Tensions are high, and competition grows thick. It was a perfect storm. The group was already too large, which meant it was feasible for enough
Jordan Peterson speaks of this in 12 Rules for Life.
linchpin individuals which bridged the gaps between smaller groups to die, weakening the overall integrity of the larger community. The territory is large because the group is large and time is passing, which means the more intermediary individuals that die over these periods of time, the less contact these smaller groups have with one another, and the less familiar they become. Add to that the tensions of a power struggle. Everybody's already fighting, everybody's already on edge, and alliances are already being made for an unrelated conflict. Fruit availability and mate access fluctuate every year, but one year, a time of scarcity comes along, and two chimpanzee individuals who groomed one another 10 years prior come upon one another again in the forest with their respective groups, being from the central and western group respectively, and they think to themselves, how well do I know you, really? Our first behavioral observation suggests...
No, they really don't do that, though. I'm sorry. What? What? Really? August says it was divided into many groups at one point, not just two. It was 5 in 2016 and 3 in 2017.
Suggestive of a split occurred on the 24th of June 2015 when members of the Western and Central clusters approached each other near the center of their territory. Rather than reuniting in typical fission-fusion fashion, the Western chimpanzees ran away and the Central chimpanzees chased them. A 6-week period of avoidance followed. Such a prolonged period of avoidance had not been observed before. And it's all downhill from there. By 2017, after months of coordinated patrols and attacks against one another, 2 distinct territories and thus 2 distinct groups were evident. There's no more reproduction between the 2 groups, and there's no more friendly affiliative behavior between the 2, not even amongst females. In fact, some of the aggressive encounters that are being carried out, including intergroup killings, females are in attendance and occasionally doing the killing. I actually attended an AABA's talk about that particular subject back in the spring, and it's notable because the females in this fission process are far more aggressive than females in chimpanzees tend to be in the regular run-of-the-mill patrols between 2 adjacent groups, which suggests that they're more violent and more aggressive when a split is in progress rather than once 2 distinct groups have been established and regular run-of-the-mill patrols are being carried out. In other words, it's all hands on deck.
Or it's not all hands on deck, because that would imply a deliberate plan, and you don't have a basis for saying that because a deliberate plan would leave an artifact. There'd be a plan, there'd be an articulation, and if they're not articulating it, I gotta ask, Gutsick, do you think these apes are coordinating telepathically? Where is this conception taking place? How is it coming about? On what plane is it written? Where is it? Has she cited a single source? Technically, yes, exactly one. Where is this constitution being proposed, debated, and ratified? Because I don't see any political organization here at all. I see creatures who largely coordinate without a codified language, without concepts in that sense, without political concepts, without concepts of law or of legitimacy, having a social breakdown, and in the alienness and the newness of these shifting relationships, exhibiting behavior that is unusual. Yeah, the argument is that this is politics, because that's what primatologists have a very bad habit of doing. Not all of them, but it's an endemic tendency in the field to attempt to do anthropology by way of primatology, instead of what you should actually be doing is doing an anthropology of primatologists and figuring out what on earth is feeding into their concepts. Because unfortunately, this has been anthropomorphization all the way through, to an extreme degree. Rickside, thank you for the 5 gifted memberships. I appreciate that.
From 2017 to present, the Western group and the Central group have been in civil war with one another. Largely, the Western group is the group carrying out the most lethal attacks, or I should say successful lethal attacks, killing on average one adult.
Here's a great point. Or something to think about. Like, if this is a civil war, then what maintains in common between these splitting groups? Because it seems like the groups just split. Civil war implies that there is, outside of these groups, a civitas, of which these groups are a part. This is war that has invaded within the realms of the political community. That's why it's a civil war. We don't regard it as a civil war when 2 states that happen to be next to each other with good relationships go into a state of war with each other. Like if Canada went to war with the United States, that wouldn't be civil war, even though you could just drive over the border relatively recently. How do you quantify chimp attitudes? In bananas, Brooks, in bananas. Obviously.
Adult male and 2 infants per year. And they're still at war now because wars rarely end quickly, whether we're talking about
wars frequently end quickly. What are you talking about?
Chimpanzees or other violent apes. I'm going to read this
Macaws?
line from the discussion/conclusion because I think it rocks. Cultural traits remain essential for large-scale cooperation, but many conflicts may originate in the breakdown of interpersonal relationships rather than in entrenched ethnic or ideological divisions. It is tempting to attribute polarization and war that occur in humans today to ethnic, religious, or political divisions. Focusing entirely on these cultural factors, however...
Is that not how you pronounce it? Macacas? I thought they were macacas. Macacas. Macaques? Macaw? Macaques is funny. I could have sworn I saw them called macaws. Whatever. It's like these guys.
overlooks social processes that shape human behavior, processes that also present in one of our closest animal relatives. In some cases, it may be in the small, daily acts of reconciliation and reunion between individuals that we find opportunities for peace. Why do apes wage civil war? Well, it isn't because of culture, it's not because of government or because of religion, it's because, evidently, we cease to know one another.
Sorry, say it one more time.
That we find opportunities for peace. Why do apes wage civil war? Well, it isn't because of culture, it's not because of government or because of religion, it's because, evidently, we cease to know one another.
The Bhagavad Gita is a dialogue between a god and a man who is struggling because he is face to face on the battlefield with a bunch of his relatives and friends, and he doesn't know how to handle going into lethal combat against his loved ones, against his kinfolk, etc., etc. That is the premise of the Bhagavad Gita. Very frequently, war is between people who know each other more than they know other people, because they have something in common to fight over. They have things in common that they care about, which is why they're at war in the first place. Certainly in the context of civil war. That's just wrong. That's just wrong. Incredibly wrong. She's getting on my last nerve. Hey, don't get mad at Gutsick, okay? Genuinely. She is playing out what is very common for her field. And I've said similarly dumb things in the past, but in other areas. Again, having a grasp on this stuff is tenuous and difficult to get to. It's difficult. I don't think she realizes that this is bullshit. I don't think she has the capacity to realize it's bullshit yet. Not because she's stupid, but because it's this stuff seems intuitive, and when a bunch of people in your field who are eminent in your field are engaging in the same thing, it seems obvious. She's dying on the cross of primatology? Nah, I don't think so. This is very typical for a video essay. As you've seen, it's very typical for an article in the field. She's not being careful, to be clear. But that's because they don't think they have to. It's institutional chauvinism, and institutional chauvinism is not reflective. I think it's more that she doesn't want to be critical of her peers. Well, that suggests that she would want to be critical of her peers. I think it's more that she has a folk understanding of politics, and she thinks that's enough because she's a primatologist, so, she understands the evolutionary basis of human behavior, because we're all primates, of course. Remember, she equates primates and humans, which is a mistake, by the way. It's a big mistake, because while we may be classified as primates, primates do not classify. Humans classify. Humans name primates primates. That is not something that primates in general do. And this is the mistake that so many people in STEM or in science generally make, which is they forget that the tools they are using to interpret the world are human. And not just human, but they're cultural and political. They are funded and taught through language, through institutions. And forgetting that is a big problem, because it turns them into fundamentalists of a different stripe.
We become estranged, and a stranger is a potential enemy. And you know what we do to enemies. We kill them before they kill us. This paper is so...
Right, which is why it's kind of a big problem for you to imply that xenophobia is natural. Because now you've suggested a humanitarian grounds for valorizing racist institutions. Because if we keep them all separate, of course, they won't tear each other limb from limb, will they? As they must if they're forced together against their nature, right? You see the problem. Science is somewhat dull. You are very incorrect, Lisa. I'm sorry. You just don't speak Ape Sunday? What are you talking about? I'm Canadian. It's my native language.
Cool, obviously. It reveals that just like everything that we think of as being unique to humans, the origins of things like war are found far deeper in the past than we previously thought. Huge round of applause to...
You remember going through the subject with counterpoints? I do. I do. Terrifying, isn't it? This is the expert understanding. And they are incalcitrant to correction. What did she just say? Let's find out.
Obviously, it reveals that potential enemy. And you know what we do to enemies. We kill them before they kill us. This paper is so cool, obviously. It reveals that just like everything that we think of as being unique to humans, the origins of things like war are found far deeper in the past than we previously thought.
Okay, now this is where I'm actually going to impugn Gutsick Gibbon, because this is bad academic practice. You are making a statement of fact that the paper was ambiguous on. The paper suggested that this may indicate something, which is fair. I disagree. I don't think it may indicate that at all, but let's leave that aside. That's fine. They're allowed to say that. You're not allowed to take a paper that provisionally says, oh, maybe this means something with respect to this question, and say, look, it proves it. It proves that this happened. This is where it came from in the past. This is where war comes from. You can't do that, because you just falsified the thesis of that paper. That paper didn't say that. You did. On the basis of nothing. Big problem. She just essentialized killing enemies. Yes, she did. For the record, Carl Schmitt doesn't say we kill the enemy. Did you know that? Carl Schmitt, who said the essence of politics is the friend-enemy distinction. The political is at its most intense when there is a friend-enemy distinction. And that implies the possibility of the annihilation of the enemy. But it is possible, in fact, overwhelmingly likely in most cases, that actually not killing the enemy is the more desirable choice. Carl Schmitt was a Nazi. Gutsick. You're behind. You're behind on the humanitarian end of things. You're behind the Nazi here. Carl Schmitt was a bad dude. I'm glad he's gone. I hope he's not entirely gone. I hope he's somewhere else that's very bad and unpleasant. But you just made a thesis that was more violent than his. What are you doing? You are an influencer. You are a science influencer. This comes with responsibility. You have great power. With that comes great responsibility, as Voltaire said. You cannot give this kind of an example of how to do textual interpretation, interpretation of research, how to make inferences on the basis of limited data. Like this is a perversion of what it is to be a science communicator, because you're not communicating science. You're communicating ideology and calling it science. You are effectively engaging in what L. Ron Hubbard did when he related human behavior, the action of the jaw, to a clam. Which he did, by the way. It's very weird. He thought that the human ancestor was a clam, which is why we have a snapping jaw. Is she about to say psyche?
Huge round of applause to Sandel and colleagues, to all of the people who were involved in not just this paper itself, but in every singular observation over the past decade or so.
Why? They didn't prove anything, Gutsick. What are you saying? The existence of a paper does not mean that there is proof of a thesis. Congratulations on a paper suggesting inaccurately. Like, what? Suggesting inaccurate. I'm really disappointed by this video. This is like, I'm going to be real too, and listen, I'm going to talk about aneurysm a bit here as well, because I've been harsh on aneurysm as well. You need to understand that when you do educational content, you are standing on the front lines of a community of people who have spent their lives trying to improve our understanding for the sake of making us less hateful towards each other and more cooperative with each other and more able to understand our world. You are taking the front lines of that interfacing with the general public. And if you do a poor job of it, or if you do a lazy job of it, you are taking those lifetimes, those thousands of lifetimes of labor, and making it for nothing by poisoning people against taking it seriously or understanding it properly. You are standing as the representation of those people and telling people and convincing them effectively whether or not they should bother to look any further. And this has profound impacts. To be clear, the role of a YouTuber in terms of affecting elections is minuscule, but we do not know the range of impact that can take place when somebody stops or provokes someone from learning, right? Stops someone from learning or provokes them to learn more. We don't know. We don't know which of these people would have done something, would have learned something or discovered something, or at the very least not acted as a barrier to somebody else learning something. This matters. Yeah, when YouTubers tell you like, hey guys, we won the election. Bullshit. There's no way to tell if they did, and they didn't, by the way. But they absolutely affected some person's mind, some person's understanding of the world, some person's openness or closedness to altering their understanding of the world, or from being receptive to the work of somebody else. And when you do stuff like this, you are not just making lame content. This isn't just YouTube. This is communication of science. This is popular science, popular philosophy. You are not just making bad content. You are robbing people who are convinced by you not to look any further of the world. And that matters. I think that matters a lot. So when I see people like Andrewism or like this doing a shoddy job and spitting out bullshit, frankly, because they couldn't be bothered to do the labor and have the humility to actually like make sure that what they are saying is justified. I need you to understand, like, I do that with intensity. I take that deadly seriously. I think that doing this badly has real consequences for us in a long-term sense. What is your streaming schedule present Sunday? I try to aim for 2:30 PDT. I'm traveling at the moment, so it's a little bit hectic. But generally, it's what I do. I feel like YouTubers do this more out of established investment into their own video. But like, Andrewism, why am I harsh on Andrewism? Andrewism has basically been spitting out videos on a host of topics that he hasn't spent any time researching into. Like, genuinely, he hasn't. Because they're unrelated. And then he ends each video the same way. Oh yeah, and how will an anarchist society address us? Well, we'll have better people who are smarter and better and nicer and kinder. We just gotta be better, okay, guys? And it's like, there's a type of person who watches that stuff, and the only thing they're there for is, look, anarchist YouTuber says solarpunk cool, but here's the thing. That person is at no point in this equation being challenged to actually think of solutions to problems. To actually, like, challenge their categories. Challenge their understanding of what, not just how things work, but what are the things that work together. In a philosophy of science class, I beefed with people over whether nature was even a useful concept. That's interesting. Interesting. Hello, In Time Raiders. Welcome. How's Nick doing? We haven't talked in a little while.